Hey guys, in this poker compilation, my team and I put together 100 of the best tips that I've shared on this YouTube channel. If you enjoy this advice and you like more in-depth poker insights delivered to you weekly, check out my newsletter at philgalfond.com. Without further ado, here's the top 100.
All right, Phil, it's another top 5. Today's top 5 is top 5 low-stakes hacks.
Okay. The top 5 low-stakes hacks. So I'm not going to refer to them as hacks, but I'll just call them tips for adjusting to low-stakes poker, which is essentially, playing with weaker opposition. So generally, the lower the stakes you go, the easier the competition is, the more mistakes they make, and typically they make them in similar kinds of ways. So number 1, play tight pre-flop. Super boring way to adjust, but it's an important one. People generally at lower stakes are too loose, and a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, they're playing such bad hands, that means I can play a bunch of bad hands too, because on average, I'm going up against weaker hands. And while it's technically true in some spots, it's slippery slope. And especially when you're in multi-way pots, bad hands do not do well. The way that you're going to beat them playing bad hands is to actually have good hands when you enter the pot. A lot of people never think of this, and it's actually kind of obvious when you think about it. So apologies for some of you who this is obvious for. But let's say we were playing poker, 9 people around a table, and normally, let's say that it's $1, $2 blinds, and we'll have $300 in our stack or something. Let's say instead of that, we just take out the blinds, so there are no blinds. We all have $300 in front of us, and the betting just starts on one person, and their option is they can put in $2, or they can raise to more, or they can fold. What hands should you play? And the answer is actually you should only play aces, because if you only play aces and you go all in, once anybody's raised, you go all in with aces, you can never lose, because you're never forced to put in money unless you're going all in with the best hand. So really, the reason we play hands is all about the blinds. And when people are playing a bunch of hands, it costs you so little in comparison to the size of the pots to just wait for better hands and enter the pot with better hands. So that's hack tip. Number 1 is play tight, play good hands. Number 2 is fast play your good hands. So a lot of people love to, raise, call. We have pocket 7s on the button. We call 5-way to the flop of queen 7-4 with 2 spades. Bet, call. A lot of people like to just call and disguise the strength of their hand and hope that somebody keeps betting into them, because it feels really good to be tricky and to just call and have them bluff off their stack to you, or have them bet turn with kings and then jam river with kings, and you say, haha, I have a set, gotcha. You don't literally, I hope you don't literally say that, but in your head you do. The thing is, at lower stakes, people are generally too passive. They're not bluffing enough. They're not putting in enough money with thin enough value hands, but they are also too loose. They're chasing draws too often. They're really stubborn. They don't want to fold top pair. So raise that flop, get them to put in more money right then with queen jack before the turn brings a straight or a flush and scares them off the hand. Or even if it doesn't scare them off the hand, then you've made the pot bigger, and now you can bet again on the turn. You can bet again on the river and get their whole stack. So just make sure you fast play your good hands, unless you have a really good reason not to. Number 3, figure out when people have to have a made hand. And so what I mean by that is you raise in early position, the button calls, the big blind calls. The flop is king 7-3 rainbow. Check. You bet half pot. The button calls, and the big blind folds. Most players, when they call there on king 7-3 rainbow, unless they specifically have 6-5 suited that they played pre-flop, or 6-4 suited or whatever, they have a pair. So find spots where you're pretty sure your opponent has a pair. And then if later in the hand they bet or raise, just fold everything that doesn't beat very good hands, because players at low stakes are essentially never turning pairs that could win at showdown into a bluff. And so continuing with the king 7-3 example, let's say king 7-3, you bet, they call, turn is a 6, bringing a flush draw, you check, they bet, you call with whatever, king 10, and then the river is an 8, bringing a flush, you check, they bet. They're just not bluffing. they just can't be bluffing anymore, and they're representing a better hand than you. Obviously, some players can be bluffing, and good players know in position, like they're going to play some hands like 6-5 that way. So they're kind of bluff. They call the flop and then they're bluffing, or like 7-5 suited. They're bluffing the turn, and then everything gets there on the river, and so they just have to bluff with that hand because it's really low in their range. But a lot of low stakes players don't think like that, and they just think that you bluff with no pair. And so when they have a pair, they just don't bluff. So look for spots where your opponents almost always have a pair and fold everything. Similarly, number 4, look for spots where a lot of draws miss, and then call rivers. Generally, I would say people at low stakes under bluff, but they also call a little bit too loose and chase draws too loose on the flop. So to give you an example, let's say you raise in middle position, the big blind defends, the flop is queen 10-7 with 2 clubs. They check, you bet, they call. Turn is an offsuit 3, check, check. River is an offsuit 4, they bet big. Well, yes, they can have some slow played sets. They can have some slow played 2-pair. They can have some top pair going for value. But there are so many bluffs for them to choose from. Like ace jack, king jack, jack 9, 9-8, 9-6 suited, 8-6 suited, king 9. I've probably forgotten some already. But then flush draws also. Like they have all of those hands that missed. And people at low stakes know that when you have no pair and you're probably not going to win unless you bet, they find those bluffs. So look for those spots to bluff catch. Lastly, I'd say adjust really, how do I want to put this? Make big adjustments to how many players see the flop. So what I mean by that is if a lot of players see the flop, basically like 5+ players, just don't bluff post flop, because what happens is you're up against 4 other hands and 1 or 2 of them probably have something. And what's supposed to happen in theory is that because there are 5 people in the pot, the thresholds for what you need to call down, what you need to bet, what you need to raise go way up. But people don't really adjust in their minds like that. They just see top pair, or they see an open ender, or they see a flush draw, and they play the way they would play if there were 5 people in the pot or 2 people in the pot. So when there are 5 people in the pot, hands are better. Just don't bluff them, like ever. When it's heads up to the flop, now you're only up against 1 hand. They usually don't have much. Now you should bluff a lot, play aggressively, because they're also, in their mind, everybody has this, barometer of what a hand is worth. Their barometer is set, it's set for like the average of hands that they see go down. And the average hand has maybe 3 or 4 players in a low stakes game seeing a flop. And so they're used to like folding the flop when they don't have much, even against a small bet. But now in a heads up pot, you need to be defending some pretty weak hands against small bets because both players don't have much pretty often. But they don't do that. So this is the spot where you get very aggressive, and find opportunities to bluff whenever you can. So yeah, that list actually came out better than I thought it was going to. So hopefully you found that helpful, and you take those hacks to the casino next time you play low stakes, and you make a lot of money. Good luck out there. Take care. Hey everybody, Phil here. I recently made a video, top 5 low stakes poker hacks. In most of my top 5s, my producer Thomas asks me a question that I have not prepared for, and I rattle off what I can off the top of my head. Because you guys like that so much, I wanted to make another video along the same lines. So this is going to be the next 5 low stakes poker hacks. This time I've prepared my answers, so I'll probably be better. If you watched the last video, I was resistant to the term hacks. I said, you know what, I'm going to call these tips. Because low stakes games can be so exploitable, can include such weak players, I actually think that hacks is appropriate, because you make one adjustment and it actually does improve your win rate significantly if you execute it. So without further ado, number 1, be nitty against 3 bets. This is not going to make you money. It's going to save you money. A lot of players in low stakes games miss so many of the 3 bets that they're supposed to make, whether it be bluffs or thinner value hands, or even value hands that are not that thin, but they're just uncomfortable raising them. And so, if you look up defending a hand like king queen offsuit or king 9 suited in a solver against certain actions, it's going to tell you to defend. But if your opponent's range is actually ace king and queen queen plus 90% of the time, you can't call those hands. You're just getting crushed. Find the discipline to make folds that are not even solver approved. They're not even optimal folds, because they are optimal folds against the opponent you're playing. Obviously, pay attention to your opponents, and if you have one who's 3-betting a massively wide range, then by all means attack it. But until your opponents prove otherwise, err on the side of folding, because their range is almost certainly too tight on average. Number 2, play aggressive. Lee? Yeah. Number 2, play aggressively. In theory, there are a lot of hand categories that don't bet and want to control the size of the pot, either because they can't get enough value across multiple streets, they don't want to be raised, whether in position or out of position, because they're hands that do pretty poorly against raises. And the third reason is often that they want to check down to then induce bluffs from your opponents. Now, a lot of weaker opponents are not raising nearly enough, both for value and as bluffs, so you don't get put in those spots. The less your opponents are raising, the more value bets have. As I mentioned in the last video, when 5 people see the flop, you have to be very, very selective regarding the hands you want to put money into the pot. If 5 people see the flop, don't start betting these thin hands. But in short-handed pots, you could do a lot more betting for value and protection and as a semi-bluff than you could in theory. In addition to not raising enough, they also don't bluff enough when you check back. So when you do check back, you're not facing those river bluffs. You're not generating that extra value. Number 3, make conversation. This is obviously only applicable to live poker, but there are a couple of reasons why making conversation is great. You'll make the game more friendly and more enjoyable. There's no real downside to making the conversation. Actually, it can keep you more welcome in the game, depending on what kind of game it is. Maybe it's a home game, and it can keep people coming back because they're having a better time. You want your opponents to have a good time playing poker. And also you just want to be a kind human. But, and here's the greedy part, you also get a lot of information. The variety of players that show up in low stakes games, the difference between the way that they play is vast. And so when you're playing against them readless, you're going to make a lot of mistakes compared to if you have been able to kind of profile them and gotten an understanding of how much poker they've played. So in these conversations with people, you get to learn how much poker they play. You get to learn what their career is. You get to learn where they're from, how often they get to the casino. And it's going to allow you to understand what you're up against more often, more readily. You can actually get a lot of information in tournaments. Tournaments attract all kinds of players. An anecdote that illustrates this, a close friend of mine was deep in the main event. He's really nice and friendly and talkative, so he is striking up conversations with lots of people. The main event's a great place to have a lot of conversations, not just strategically, but it's a really fun environment. Everybody's really excited to be there. You get people from all walks of life. But anyways, the guy sitting next to him was a non-pro and knew that he was a pro. And as they started to approach the bubble, they weren't quite that close, but it was the day that the bubble was going to burst. He started asking my friend, if I fold every hand now, will I make the money? And first my friend's like, no. I mean, my friend was honest. He's like, no, we're too far away. You're going to blind off your whole stack. And then every 15 minutes, he would ask again. And my friend would just tell him, no, not yet. 15 minutes passes. Can I fold to the money yet? No, not yet. And then eventually, can I fold to the money yet? Yeah, you can. I mean, he was honest with him the whole time. He gave him the right advice. But it's, throughout this process, he knows, first of all, that this player is very excited about making the money and very nervous about not making the money. So he's going to play really cautiously. And then further than that, he actually knows whether or not he's playing any hands because he's following my friend's advice. By the time it got to, yes, you can fold every hand to the money, he knows this player is not going to play any hands. But yeah, if my friend wasn't so outgoing and talkative, that info doesn't ever come to him, and he doesn't have that story to tell. So number 4 and 5 are actually both about 3-betting, but different areas of it. Before I get into those, if you're enjoying this content, I'd really appreciate if you would let me know if you would like this video and if you'd subscribe if you'd like to see more of it. But without further ado, hack number 4, which is 3-bet vastly different ranges against early position and late position opens. And I guess secondarily, if you start to get to know your opponents, some weaker players open the same range from everywhere. And in that case, you don't need to do this. Others are too tight for every position, and then you still don't really want to attack their late position opens. Some people are too loose from every position. You kind of want to attack all of their opens, even if they're early position. But the reason this works is because most players who are not super experienced don't adjust enough to the situation. So, when they open under the gun, they have a relatively tight range. If you make a big 3-bet
out of the big blind, let's say, they're supposed to fold some pretty good hands, but people tend to not do that. But similarly, if they open on the button, I mean, some people open 90% of hands on the button, whereas others, are opening 50% or somewhere in between. When you 3-bet them, they kind of have this idea in their head of what's good enough to call a 3-bet with. When they open under the gun, maybe 80% of the range is good enough to call a 3-bet with. But when they open on the button, to them, it might be more like 30%. So, if you're 3-betting against somebody who's folding 70% of the time, you're going to make a lot of money pre-flop. And then you also get to see a flop most of the time that they do call, and you realize some equity there. So really attack those late position opens against these players who aren't adjusting enough. What's supposed to happen in theory is they open 50% on the button, you 3-bet, they have to defend some kind of weak hands, because otherwise what you're supposed to do is 3-bet a bunch of weak hands. And if you're doing that, then they get to defend weak hands, et cetera, et cetera. But because a lot of these players aren't adjusting, you can just kind of go crazy and attack. And I also want to point out that you don't just attack with bluffs. People who are overfolding, it helps to just 3-bet, King 10 suited when you otherwise weren't going to. That works well as a 3-bet against button opens, whether they're loose or tight. But I just want to illustrate that. Don't 3-bet a super polarized range against them, like Queens plus and 7-6 suited and 9-3 suited or something like that. Just 3-bet a lot of everything. Even the hands that are pretty good are going to overperform when they're folding so much. Number 5, which is also about 3-betting, is essentially isolate weaker players. Isolate refers to either somebody's limped and you raise to force other people out of the pot so you can play with them, or somebody's raised and you 3-bet to force other people out of the pot and play the pot with them. People tend to not play well when they're not the aggressor. And if you're at a table with, half the table's weak, half the table's strong, you want to be playing heads up pots against weaker players. So isolating them serves the purpose of isolating them and playing the pot with them more often. You should especially do this in position, because everybody tends to play more poorly out of position, tends to be more uncomfortable out of position. And when you are in position, you should especially do this with deeper stacks. So when you're in position with deeper stacks, I would take this concept pretty far. And once again, don't just 3-bet a polarized range of really strong hands and bluffs. If somebody is weak enough and stacks are deep enough and you're in position, I would just not call any hands if they've opened and nobody else has called, or even if they've opened and somebody's called who you think is pretty likely to fold to the 3-bet. Just every hand you want to play a 3-bet. Yes, your variance is going to go up a little bit. You need to be playing properly bankrolled for the stakes that you're playing, because you're going to be playing bigger pots more often, but your edge is going to go up a lot with it. And when your edge goes up with your variance, it actually doesn't increase your odds of having a downswing. It actually can often reduce them. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you can apply some of these to your games if you're playing in low stakes games and or playing against weaker players. And especially if you've made some of these adjustments and have had good results, let me know, because I'd love to hear about it. Until next time, take care and good luck.
Hey everybody, Phil Galfond here with another top 5. My producer Thomas is going to throw a category at me. I hope you're ready for it. I'm ready for it. Thomas, let's go. Beginners often struggle with hand reading. Hand reading is a crucial skill in poker, and what I find beginners often do, pay way too much attention to their hand and the board, how much they like their hand, or they just put their opponent on one hand. Their opponent raises pre-flop and then bets queen 7-3, bets the deuce turn, and they're like, well, I put him on ace-king, because they know ace-king is a hand he'd play pre-flop, and so that's it. And they kind of hope he has ace-king. Hand reading is much more complex than that. You need to follow the way that your opponent is played across each street, and each time think about the types of hands that he would do that with, types of hands that he would not do that with. Hand reading is a multi-street process. Now, if you're a beginner, you're not supposed to go from 0 to 100. You're supposed to kind of work your way up to this and start hand reading a little bit as the hand goes on, but not all the way. So the way I'd suggest you do that by observing the hands that you're not involved in, because when you're involved in the hand, you have so much to process regarding your hand, the board, the bets that are going in, whether you want to bet or check. There's a lot to think about already. As you progress in poker, as you play a lot more poker, those things become not automatic. Some of them become automatic, but some of them also just become much faster, and you have more capacity, more mental bandwidth to also process hand reading, to also process tells. Focus on hands that you are not involved in, and think when one opponent bets the river, what kind of value hand are they saying that they have? Would they have
check the flop with that hand? Would they have bet the turn with that hand, or would they have gone for a check raise? Just think through. The more practice you get, the better you're going to be, the more automatic it becomes. Focus on a lot of the hands that you're not involved in. Not only will you get that practice in hand reading, but you'll actually get information on your opponents when they show down their hands or when they don't show down their hands, because you're actually paying attention. Most of us do not pay attention once we fold. Beginners often struggle with figuring out what their hand is worth. People play for a little while, they kind of get a baseline gauge of how good a certain hand is, how good a hand needs to be to value bet the river, how good a hand needs to be to call the river or call the turn. But the problem is they're not adjusting enough for all of the various variables that go into that decision. For example, when you're facing a pot-sized river bet, when the flop and turn have been checked down, the type of hand that you need to call is not crazy strong. When you're facing a pot-sized river bet after someone bet the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river, you have to keep in mind that your range has been narrowed. By calling those other streets, your range has been narrowed, your opponent's range has been narrowed, not just because of the pot size, but because of how many times each of you have said, I like my hand. The thresholds for what constitutes a good enough hand to call, a good enough hand to value bet especially, go way up. In some spots like button opens, big blind calls, they make a small c-bet on a certain board. You can call with a lot of very weak stuff on the flop. If instead under the gun opens and the small blind 3-bets and then you call and then you're facing a small bet, like ranges are much, much different now. You can't call with as weak of a hand as you could in that button versus big blind single raise pot scenario. So it's basically understanding what hands are worth in the different scenarios, and it's based on how much money has gone in and in what spots the money has gone in. So an open under the gun is not the same as an open on the button. A bet into 6 people on the flop is not the same as a bet into 1 person on the flop. A bet and a call with 5 players to act behind them is not the same as a bet and a call with nobody else to act or 1 player to act behind you. So adjust these thresholds based on the way that the action has gone. Take into account how much money has gone in and where it's gone in from. Beginners often struggle with bluffing. It's a broad category and people struggle in different ways. Some people just bluff every time they have a missed draw. Some people never bluff, and everything in between. A really important aspect of bluffing is understanding your value range. And this is essentially hand reading yourself. Given what I did pre-flop, given the way the boards run out, how many hands do I have that would bet for value? And what size would I bet those hands? Oftentimes people will get to the river, they have a weak hand, they're like, I can't win unless I bet, so I bet. And they don't even think about what bet size to use. Or they think, well, I want them to fold, so I'm gonna bet really big. Or they'll think, well, I don't wanna risk a lot, so I'll bet really small. People do different things. The way that you should really decide how much to bet with your bluffs is, what's the most common value hand that I have in this spot? And what would I bet with that hand? That's exactly what I should bet with my bluffs so that my opponents can't pick up on the differences. Beginners often struggle with adapting to all the different scenarios in poker. Specifically, the most obvious one is position. When you're under the gun 9-handed, you need to be very tight. And when you're on the button 9-handed and it's folded to you, you need to be a lot looser. Ace Queen is just as good as Ace Queen. It's the same hand. You have fewer players to get through. And I think what will really help some people, although it's kind of advanced theoretical and weird to think about, is the fact that everything that happens in poker, starting with pre-flop, it's all about stealing the blinds, fighting over the blinds. If there were no blinds, there would be no reason to play basically any hands except for aces. Everything is about the blinds. When you're opening pre-flop, what you're doing is accomplishing 2 things. 1, you have fold equity, you could steal the blinds. And 2, because those blinds need to be defended in theory, because other people need to fight over those blinds, you're also getting them hopefully to put in money with worse hands. With the weaker hands in your opening range, you're hoping to steal the blinds. With the stronger hands, you're hoping to get value from people defending those blinds, whether they're in the blinds themselves or in another position. When you open an early position, yeah, you could steal the blinds, but you have 8 players behind you with random hands to fight against. Opening weak hands from under the gun is not going to work out well. However, on the flip side, on the button, you only have 2 players to get through to steal that 1.5 big blinds, maybe more if there's an ante. They're just going to have 2 random hands for you to fight against. So now the threshold of how strong of a hand you need to enter the pot gets lowered. Especially if they're extra tight, it gets way lowered. And this difference carries over to the next decision and the next decision. If you're in the small blind and you're facing an open raise, you should not 3-bet the same range against the button as you would against under the gun. Under the gun's opening a much tighter range, so you need to 3-bet a much tighter range against them. Against the button, they're opening a pretty wide range. You don't need as strong of a hand to 3-bet them. And similarly, post-flop, once you see a flop like you've called a raise out of the big blind, you need to be a lot more careful against under the gun than against the button. yes, the button's going to connect with more like low boards than under the gun is going to. So they might have some surprise big hands like flop 2 pair and low straights and things like that. But under the gun is going to have so few bluffable hands as a hand plays out, especially if there are high cards on the board, that you need to be very careful. You need to proceed with caution against them, much more caution than you need to against the button. A very important skill that beginners struggle with is bankroll management. It's really key. Whether you are a recreational player who is just playing for fun, you need to then decide how much you're willing to lose and are comfortable losing so that you're playing in a way that you're enjoying yourself, having fun, and not playing scared to the point where you're actually losing more money than you would be otherwise if you're an underdog in the game. Obviously, some recreational players can be winners in the game too, and then there's even more consideration then to making sure you have an edge because you have a good mindset and you're in a good state of mind because you're playing in a level you're very comfortable with, etc. Now, if you're looking to play professionally or semi-professionally, you need to know how real variance is. There are variance calculators out there. PokerDope.com has a good one. They will show you just how unlucky it's possible to get and for how long. And spoiler alert, it's longer than you think, and it's more unlucky than you think. Making sure that you're well rolled, not only to withstand those swings, but also to make sure that you play in a good state of mind, that when you lose 5 buy-ins, you're not pulling all your hair out. You're like, okay, well, I'm well prepared for this. I have another 95 buy-ins behind. This is just one long session. This time it didn't go well. I have a lot more sessions to play and make that up. I personally did a very bad job of bankroll management. When I started playing as a total beginner, and I was playing $10 sit and goes with $100. That's 10 buy-ins. You can very easily lose 10 buy-ins, especially if you're a beginner. But yeah, bankroll management solves so many problems. I hope you found that helpful. I always enjoy doing my best, giving it my best shot at these top 5s on the fly.
All right, Phil, it's another top 5. So off the top of your head, what's the best poker advice you've ever been given?
I might be kind of slow in between these, but I like that one. All right, so the first one is definitely from Tommy Angelo, who's a mentor to me early in my career, mentor and a friend. He explained to me that, let's say that you're playing 5-10 at the casino, and let's say you're a 20 big blind per 100 winner. You're playing, let's just call it 33 hands an hour to be a little bit, well, the math is not simple, but basically you're making, $67 an hour. You've been playing all day, you're down $5K, which, is not a ridiculous loss for those stakes, but an unfortunate day. You buy in for 2K, you lost 2 buy-ins and half of another buy-in. You're not really enjoying yourself there, and you feel like you should quit, but you don't want to. And you think, you know what, let's play one more hour. What Tommy said to me is, if you're in this scenario, you have to remember that poker as a whole, you're thinking about your hourly earn, your average earn. So you're down $5,000. Maybe you're right and you can play, fine. Maybe you're doing fine and the game's pretty good. Maybe you can keep earning that hourly. Let's give you that. You're down $5,000. Do you want to stay for another hour to make $67 back? And I really like that reminder, that framing, because so often when we're in the game, it is possible to win a huge pot and get halfway unstuck. But we're not playing poker to try to get lucky. We're playing poker to earn over the long period of time. We're actually trying to fade luck. We're trying to fight against luck. When you're saying to yourself, another hour, and then maybe after that, another hour, what you're actually doing is gambling. Because if you were to put in the perspective of, do I want to put myself through this, potentially risk continuing playing when I'm not playing very well, when I'm in a bad mood for $67, when I'm down $5K? No, you don't. That's not why you're doing it. And so when you frame it that way, you can make a lot better quitting decisions. This next one is not exactly advice. It's more of a warning, but it's something that really stuck with me. It's something I saw really early. I must have been 20. So almost 18 years ago. Is from a friend of mine now named Craig, who at that time was somebody that I looked up to. Never met in person, but looked up to on the internet. He played in games that I wanted to play in and posted on 2+2 forums, which is where I consumed a lot of knowledge and posted as well. Craig said, "You will eventually run worse than you ever thought possible." And this really stuck with me because essentially we all know that downswings can happen and bad runs can happen, but our natural expectation of what it could really look like. And not just if we sit here and I ask you directly, how bad do you think a downswing can get for you? We don't give it enough credit. We never really believe it's going to happen to us. Like, yes, it's possible to go on a downswing for 2 years with the win rate I have. But, you know, it's not going to happen. But in reality, every time you play a new hand, you're kind of starting a new sample at which you can begin an extended downswing. It's not just like you're playing 1 year and your chances of that year being bad are X. It's actually you're beginning new samples from which you can experience a really improbable event, but you keep starting these so many times that eventually that improbable event happens. And I really liked the way that Craig framed this because it was kind of the only way to get it to land in for a lot of people and for me at that point in my career. And it really prepared me for that to come true, which is, it absolutely is true. If you play for long enough, it's going to happen. The third one is from Tom Dwan, who I guess I was 22. I was living in a house over the summer with him and 9 other guys for WSOP. I was showing him a hand that I played, and I was asking if I should call or fold the river. And he thought for a little bit, and he said, I would raise. Essentially, at that point, I didn't view hands that, you know, were decent bluff catchers to be good raising candidates. And what I realized through talking with him further was the way that Tom thought through the hand was, it was pretty clear that I had something given the way the hand had played out. I had called a couple of times in a spot where I basically couldn't have any draws left. I was out of position. I wasn't check calling with a queen high flush draw against big bets. And especially at the time, but even still, players didn't bluff that often when they had something. They bluffed a lot when they didn't have something. And so what Tom recognized in that situation is a lot of people overfold when it's clear that you have something and then you're raising, basically turning made hands into bluffs. And it kind of unlocked, you know, a whole other part of the game tree in my mind for consideration when I played hands from then on. The fourth one is also from Tommy Angelo. I could probably do a top 5 Tommy Angelo advice video. Let's say that you go to the airport and you show up on time, you're waiting at your gate, and then you find out that your flight's delayed 30 minutes. Tommy doesn't get upset when that happens because getting delayed is one of the things that flights regularly do. It's just something that's supposed to happen a lot of the time. He kind of approaches life and poker in this way, that you have to know what to expect. And if you're not going to be surprised by anything, then it's just one of the things that's supposed to happen, and you don't need to let it bother you. I mean, a specific quote he would say is, you know, if an asshole is being an asshole to me, I'm not surprised. That's what assholes do. Obviously, at the poker table, the way this translates is when you get it in with aces against ace 10 offsuit and you lose, that's something that's supposed to happen, whatever percentage of the time, a pretty small percentage of the time, but it's something that's supposed to happen. When you flop middle set and you get all your money in and you happen to be up against top set, that's one of the things that's supposed to happen. These are all things that happen. I don't think I ever became as zen as Tommy. I don't think many people are, but that approach still stuck with me. And I've kind of recognized that if I'm upset by something that's going to happen reasonably often, that's a failing on my part. So it's a lack of preparation, emotional and mental preparation on my part. So off the top of my head, I'm running out. I'm sure I could go look back at one of Tommy's books and list 10 more. But I guess for the fifth, I will go with advice that I gave. And I gave it technically to other people, but also to myself. I've already recorded a longer video about this, but so I'll be succinct here. Throughout hands, we so often are fearing a certain turn card or hoping our opponent checks or regretting an action we recently took. We have it stuck in our head. And all of these emotions, or not emotions, but all of these thoughts are not useful to us. Don't hope for a turn card. Don't fear an opponent's action. Don't spend time thinking about the play you just made. Every time that action is on you, it's an opportunity to make the right play. So don't worry about what's already happened or what's going to unfold, because when you get into that situation, whatever does unfold, your job is just to make the right decision in that situation. And that's going to be true no matter what turn card hits, no matter what your opponent does. It's just another turn for you to make the right play. I hope you found these as helpful as I did throughout my career. Let me know in the comments which spoke to you the most and which you found the most helpful. Did you know that the top 5% of poker players make 90% of the money? Okay, if I'm being honest, that's not a real stat. They don't track these kind of things very well. I really think that's roughly what it would be if I had to guess. I would love to provide you with interesting stats like that, but nobody's doing the studies. Anyways, I'm Phil Galfond. I have been playing professional poker for half my life. I've been playing against the best in the world for over a decade and a half, which is relevant because today my producer, Thomas, asked me about the top 5 qualities that elite poker players have. So if you're interested in learning what makes the best and interested in finding out if you have some of those traits, here we go.
All right, Phil, this is top 5 common traits of winning poker players.
Okay. I like that one. There are actually 2 different ways to take this question, and the way that I'm personally more interested in is top 5 traits of the most successful poker players. We could maybe do a different one another day of traits of winning poker players that are winning at a modest amount. But I'm interested in talking about the elite and what I've noticed because I've played against a lot of elite players and I'm friends with a lot of elite players. I've got more unique insight into that than most people. Top 5 traits of elite poker players. Every elite poker player that I know is really strong with logical reasoning, deductive logic. A really common question is, what areas of intelligence are most important? Is it math? To me, far and away, the answer is logic. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, I took logic in college, but you don't have to have taken a class in it. There are a few different ways to, so one is hand reading is essentially deductive logic. It's, okay, so my opponent's played it this way. This is the range of hands that my opponent has, but here's what I know about my opponent. This kind of eliminates these or makes these less likely. I also know that on this next street, we can remove those, and so on and so forth. And then the more important way and the trickier way is, okay, so I know these things about my opponent, either in this individual hand, or also I've looked at stats on my opponent and I know my opponent's not delay c-betting the turn often enough. Then you have to use logic to figure out the correct counter strategy because it's not always intuitive. A lot of counter strategies don't involve attacking that leak or that weakness right away, but attacking it on future streets or planning for it ahead of time. So far and away, I think the area of intelligence that's most important is logic. Next one is a huge competitive drive. I can't think of any elite poker players who are not fiercely competitive, at the very least with themselves, but often with other people as well. You'll find a lot of poker pros were college athletes, some professional athletes, and if not college or professional, just very athletic, even in high school. Doyle Brunson was a basketball player. Gus Hansen did a few things. Patrick Antonius was a tennis player. I think David Benjamin was a tennis player. Is that right? A lot of people from my generation, Jason Kuhn was a college sprinter. There are a lot that I'm going to forget about, but tons of athletes. And it's not that their athletic talent has anything to do with their poker abilities. It's that competitive drive, that doing what it takes because you have that strong drive to win and to be the best is massively important if you're going to be elite. Next is self-awareness. There are a few elite pros without much self-awareness, but they do get themselves in trouble a lot. Most elite pros are self-aware enough to know when they're in a game that is definitely not good for them. They have enough humility to admit that. They're self-aware enough to know when they're in a good state of mind, and when they're not in a good state of mind, what are the types of thoughts that are going through their head, which lets them get to the root of the issue. Similarly, you just know your weaknesses. People who are not willing to admit their weaknesses aren't going to get to improve upon them. And so when you combine self-awareness and I guess humility a little bit with that fierce competitive drive, you get somebody who is aware of a lot of their weaknesses and works really, really hard to improve upon them. Next is passion for the game. Every elite poker player I know, at least at some point, absolutely was obsessed with poker, loved poker, was not just in it to make money, just fascinated with the game. And I think that's what it takes to get really, really good, because otherwise it's just a little too boring and it's a little too hard emotionally if you don't have that love of the game itself. I don't believe love of the game can be learned or worked on. I think you either love it or you don't. If you're here, I think there's a good chance you probably love poker. So that's a good first step. If you do love poker, by the way, subscribe, because I make a lot of videos about poker. Yeah, loving poker is a prerequisite for becoming elite. All right, so I'm struggling with a fifth, so I'm gonna kind of cheat and do 3 smaller ones, which I think are not as important as the other 4 things that I've listed. Intelligence is in math and psychology, not necessarily, clinical psychology. You don't have to have studied psychology, but an interest in understanding and how people think. Lastly, empathy, which is similar to psychology, but I think being able to empathize with other players helps you get inside their head more than just a general idea of how people think. Most elite players have some combination of these. For what it's worth, the math in poker is not very complicated. You just need to, high school level math is as far as you need to go, but you need to be pretty good at high school level math. You need to have an aptitude, I think, for math. And that's true almost without exception. There are a few excellent players who I've encountered who are not great at math. So if you're not, it doesn't mean it's the end of the road for you. And certainly a lot of good players who are not great at math. But most of the elite players I can think of have a good math aptitude. You don't need to have taken, college level calculus or beyond that. But it helps if numbers come easily to you. I'll put it that way. Psychology and empathy, I guess I've already talked about, but it's essentially, so much of poker is understanding yourself, which is in self-awareness, and understanding your opponents, empathizing with your opponents, thinking about the desires they might have and how that affects their play, the fears they might have and how that affects their play, thinking about what type of thought process might lead them to play the way you've observed them playing. Because if you can take a good guess at that, you can then extrapolate to other situations, and with what you know about them based on the way they've played a few hands, what your guess is. I mean, based on the way they play a lot of hands, if we're going to say no about them, you can take some better guesses at the way they would play different hands, and especially things that they would not do.
Top 5 multi-tabling poker tips.
Top 5 multi-tabling poker tips. So I don't know if there are 5, but I think some people would find this useful. So what I would say about multi-tabling is people who have never multi-tabled and then try to multi-table, they struggle a lot, and they say, how could you possibly play 8 tables at the same time? I can't even play 2 and keep track of what's going on. And the fact of the matter is, it's just something that you exercise like a muscle, and then you can get good at. It's not a skill that many people innately have. It's just a skill that you practice and you get used to. The more poker you play, the more easily you can, make a decision, go elsewhere, come back and remember all the previous decisions and that you made in that hand and what you were thinking at the time, what you know about that player. And so it's just something that comes with practice, not just practice multi-tabling, but practice playing poker in general. But even if you're a really experienced live poker player or online poker player that's just one-tabled, and you're going to try to play 2 tables, or you're a 2-tabler and you want to try to play 4 tables, I would say just work your way up to it in practice, and eventually, probably faster than you think, it'll become easier than it feels right now. The other thing about multi-tabling that I would say is I think people make a lot of bad decisions chasing EV or like theoretical EV. And so what I mean by that is, let's say I'm playing 5-10 no limit, and I think that I make 5 big blinds per 100 hands, which is $50 per 100 hands, math. And I normally play 3 tables, and maybe I have like a bunch of history that I make that amount. So then I'm, playing, let's say 80 hands per hour on each table. Let's just simplify and round it to, I'm playing 250 hands an hour. So then I'm making $125 an hour. A lot of times especially if there are a lot of games running that seem good, somebody will say like, oh, well, I'm going to play 8 tables because $50 per 100 hands times 8 tables, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to embarrass myself again trying to do math. But the problem is every table that you add, your skill degrades on all of your tables. And especially today when edges are relatively thin, going from a 3 big blind winner and then playing worse because you're unfocused, because you're playing on too many tables, can very easily drop you down to, first of all, if it drops you down to a 1 big blind winner or a half a big blind winner, adding those tables cost you money. But second of all, it's not hard for it to drop below 0 if you're a winning player, and but just barely. And then you're playing more tables, you're now a losing player. And I mean, the consequences are obvious, perhaps, but some of the non-obvious or less obvious consequences are, even if your expectation is the same, going from like a 4 big blind winner on 4 tables to a 2 big blind winner on 8 tables, your variance kind of shoots up because your standard deviation stays the same, but when your win rate drops, gets cut in half, you are much more often going to have big downswings. And I've talked about in previous videos the effects of that, not just the money you lost, but the emotional impact and the ability to continue playing, and the ability to make good decisions while you're playing. If you do continue playing, mean that I highly recommend being very vigilant with regards to tracking your performance as you add more tables, and just keep in mind that dropping tables is an edge against somebody who's not doing it.
Do work on your mindset. Don't start off paying for it, because I've already done so. I've included the lessons I've learned and paid for over my 20-year career in my free ebook, Poker Mindset Strategy. You can get your copy in the pinned comment below. Now back to the tips.
Hey everybody, Phil here. Today I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain at 5 kind of silly sticky notes that I have on my computer monitor to remind me of things that are important to my game. Obviously, these won't all apply to you, but I do think that some of the concepts you'll find helpful. So the first note I have just reads, "It's so simple." And this note is here to remind me to focus on the game that I've prepared for. So when I play, I go into each session against each opponent, each match with a game plan that I work on away from the table. I study the approach that I want to take in solvers, and then as I study that opponent over time, I adjust that to what I want to do against them to exploit their tendencies. Sometimes what happens to me is in game, I sense patterns, and normally pattern recognition is really useful for a poker player, but oftentimes our barometer of patterns can be misleading. So let's say I go into a session with a plan of, on rivers, I know that if a few draws miss, this player overbluffs, so I'm going to overcall with bluff catchers on river. We play a hand out, and it gets to showdown, and my opponent checks, and he checked with a hand that I thought would always bluff in this spot. And so I start to question, okay, is my plan good, or is he adjusting, knowing what I'm doing in the last couple of sessions? I start to get in my head. The same thing can be true of, oh, he's check raised 3 paired flops in a row. Maybe he's away from the table, developed a game plan to attack paired flops, and now I need to do something about it. So the problem with this is, first of all, oftentimes these reads in game are driven by fear. There's a voice in the back of my head, oh, he's attacking this, or he's taking advantage of you in a spot that you weren't prepared for. And that comes from a place of fear. Now, in practice, of course, maybe my opponent did make an adjustment and I need to react to it. But the thing is, I have so much time in between sessions when I'm not playing, when that voice in the back of my head that is based on emotion is not yelling at me, to calmly look back at stats, look back at hands that were played and reach showdown, and determine whether or not my opponent is likely to have actually made an adjustment, and then I can formulate a counter strategy. So not only am I going to analyze it worse in game, I also don't have time to formulate a counter strategy, so I'm actively playing. I mean, I personally can do a pretty good job of figuring out a counter to a perceived leak or tendency, but you're always going to do better away from the table. The other thing is that obviously sometimes we're just getting fooled by randomness. Maybe the reason that your opponent's check raised paired boards 3 times is that he's had trips 3 times, or maybe he's had trips twice and a perfect bluffing combo once, or maybe he's had 3 perfect bluffing combos and he's playing the exact same strategy as he's always played. It's so important not to overreact to tiny, tiny samples like that, especially when you're emotional and in the heat of battle. Maybe the reason your opponent checked back that river that you didn't expect him to is because your perception of how your opponent views that board and views their range is not exactly in line with the way they actually view that board and view that range. Or maybe your opponent is not in a bluffing mood today, or maybe your opponent is not in a bluffing mood that very minute because he just lost a big pot. There are so many explanations for slightly unusual play over a tiny sample, and reacting to it in game is something that I think can only go poorly. The last reason that I think making those big deviations in game or reacting to the way that your session is playing out in game can go wrong is that it can often feel like, let's use the same example, our opponent's check raised the flop on a paired board 3 times, and we folded 3 times because we didn't have anything. It can feel like your game plan is not prepared for that. But if you prepared well, studying with whatever method you use, with a coach, with a solver, with a combination of a solver and your opponent's stats breaking down the way that you want to counteract the way that they play, your game plan is probably pretty close to fine and not super exploitable to being check raised on a paired flop, for example. So I happened to have a terrible hand 3 times in a row and I got check raised and I just folded. And it feels like in that tiny sample, he's running me over. But in reality, I'm going to have trips sometimes. I'm going to have overpairs sometimes. I'm going to have flush draws. I'm going to have combo draws. I'm going to have a lot of hands that can fight back. And the fact that I didn't have those hands in the moment can make it feel like this is a leak in my game that my opponent's taking advantage of and I have to do something about it. In reality, it's just not. So there was one match I was playing a while ago. My opponent was somebody who just did not make enough big bluffs. So of course, when the pot was checked down till the river and he didn't have anything, he would bluff. And if he called a flop bet, turn went check check, and he missed his draw, he would bluff, things like that. When he has a really good blocker, he's going to throw in a 2-barrel or occasionally 3-barrel bluff. But for the big river check raises, for the big 3 barrels and 3-bet pots, he just wouldn't go for it. And this was especially true of spots where I could have a very strong hand. He was just, in my assessment, afraid to bluff in those situations. And I was playing a session and we played out a pot. I actually don't know the exact board. I 3-bet, he called, I checked, he bet, and he bet 3 times. And he 3-barreled in a big pot, all in on the river. And his hand at showdown was a hand that was, I would have expected him to bluff. Had no relevant blockers. It was just, seemed pretty crazy to me. And in that session, I was pretty afraid because I was planning to overfold in every big pot. And if I was wrong about that, if he'd noticed that in previous sessions I was doing that, this is an exploit that he can employ that really would take advantage of my strategy in a big way. I had that fear, and I did adjust my play a little bit in that session. Fortunately, we didn't get into too many big pots where he was putting a lot of money in, because that just, frequency-wise doesn't happen that often. But when I looked back after the session, I actually looked that hand up in a solver, and his bluff was solver approved. I was very surprised. So I didn't think that it was a solver approved bluff. And so I thought, wow, if he's even bluffing, like I didn't even think he bluffed all the hands that a solver would, or even close. And he's bluffing this crazy hand that I would never consider bluffing. But it actually turns out he just had a better understanding of proper strategy in that spot. And he realized that he actually had a really good combination for bluffing. And I was the one who didn't understand that. And so that's one example of a time where I felt, for very good reason, afraid in game. And I found out after the session, after looking up the hand, I did not need to be so afraid. So my next note says discipline, power. The elements that I judge my sessions on are discipline, power, and focus. I don't need a note that tells me to focus because I always know that's a good thing. Discipline, I think, is the more obvious one. People know what that word means, but essentially for me, there are spots when you're autopiloting where you've got like a decent bluff catcher plus some outs and you're facing a big turn bet and you're like, I'm pretty sure this is a call. In theory, I just flick in the call. Or you're facing a small river bet in a spot where you have a decent bluff catcher and you don't go through the process of hand reading, or I don't go through the process of hand reading and I just flick in the call. These are situations where I'm lacking discipline, because sometimes if I know my opponent well enough, I could know that given the way the board ran out and the actions my opponent has taken, he's going to underbluff that river spot. Or given the way that, same thing, he's going to have too strong of a range for me to call that turn bet. Obviously, all the examples that I've come up with in this video so far involve me being up against nitty opponents and me needing to find more folds. But when it comes to discipline, it's very applicable. Obviously, against opponents who are overly aggressive and bluffing too much, I need to find more calls. But usually when I'm having an undisciplined session, I don't struggle finding the calls. When I'm having an undisciplined session, I do struggle finding the folds For me, specifically against small bets on turn and river, and against bets on flop and turn where I have hands that have a little bit of value and can improve. Those are the types of spots where I call too often when I'm being undisciplined. Power is not as self-explanatory as discipline, so allow me to explain it to you. The way that I use power as it relates to poker, I guess the closest words that embody the sentiment there would be intensity and relentless execution. When I'm playing a session without enough power, I'll find myself in a spot where I know that my opponent is betting a little bit too weak of a range on the turn, and I know that if I check raise, bluff the turn, and jam river, he's going to overfold overall, and it's a profitable play by a little bit, but I just don't feel like doing it. I don't feel like taking that risk, and I shy away. And usually the plays that go first are those big bluffs, and then sometimes the big calls that I think are plus, 1 or 2 big blinds in EV. Those go away, and I kind of play a more lax session. The problem with this, especially when you're playing against tough competition, as I almost always do, is that when I have the value hand that's supposed to check raise the turn and bomb river, I'm never going to shy away from that. And so what happens is my range gets out of whack. Every time I have the value hand, I go for it because going for it is easy. It's emotionally easy. But when I'm in a low power mood, I don't go for it with the bluffs. And so when my opponent's sitting there on the river and I'm supposed to be bluffing something like a third of the time, I'm actually bluffing maybe 12% of the time in a low power session. And so if I have half of my sessions as low power, I always put myself in bad spots where I have to do math on the fly. But essentially, if half my sessions are at low power, then maybe my average bluff frequency there is 22% instead of the 33% that it needs to be. And even if my opponent can't figure out when I'm in a low power session or having a low power 2 hours of a session, I'm still not going to find enough bluffs overall, and I'm going to be under bluffing that spot. So my opponent can exploit me if he figures that out by overfolding. Power is one of the toughest ones for me to consistently maintain. It's so easy to start a session with power, do a lot of things. I do a lot of things pre-session to prepare, which we could talk about in another video. But it's easy to start a session with power for me, but lose a couple pots early, sometimes win a couple pots early, or just have 3 hours go on and I'm feeling pretty comfortable having fun. It's easy for me to lose that power and just not be in the mood to make the big play. The next note that I have says hand read in all caps, underlined with an exclamation point. This doesn't require as much explanation. You get it. Hand reading is important. It's so easy to, in a session, revert to autopilot and be in a river spot facing a bet and say, well, I have the spade blocker. This hand's supposed to call. Click call and move on. Or, oh, I don't have a good blocker to call here. Click fold and move on. When I'm playing my best, in every given spot, I'm reading the way that my opponents played on every street. I'm thinking about the way that they've played essentially every hand that we've played together before, my profile of them that I have in my mind. I'm thinking, okay, given the board ran out this way, do I think that they're going to struggle to find enough bluffs? Do I think that they're going to struggle to restrict their bluffs and then be over bluffing? Oftentimes, the single blocker on the river is going to move things like 1 or 2%, whereas there are so many spots, even against great players, where I think they're 15% off with their frequencies. Reverting to autopilot, just letting the 1 or 2% things like blockers shift my river play is essentially just lazy play. And it's really, really hard to play for 6 hours straight with complete focus and complete power and complete discipline and hand reading throughout. It's just hard. Our minds, or my mind, is not built to be able to sustain the same level of energy and focus throughout that entire time. So I've got that sticky note there to remind me throughout the session, all right, Phil, we've fallen a little bit off course. Let's take this opportunity to refocus, settle in, and play our best. Hey, before this next one, if you are enjoying this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'm making a lot more content in the coming months, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. All right, the fourth note that I have sticking on my computer says, game plan, no protection, which probably looks strange to people who are not poker players. In poker, what this means to me is stop making the lazy protection bets on flop and turn. A lot of people watching this are probably going to ask me, Phil, what's wrong with betting for protection? Isn't that part of the game? The real answer is going to be a 10, 20-minute video. My answer for now will be that protection is a tiny slice of the reason that you want to bet flops and bet turns. But the way that people tend to approach it is they overvalue it way too much. I overvalue it less than almost anybody, and I still have the note to remind myself not to overvalue it too much. So that gives you an idea of how important I think it is, or how flawed I think the way most people think through spots when it comes to protecting your hand actually is. I'll leave you with a little quote from a friend of mine that I found really helpful on this topic. I was reviewing a hand with a friend, a pretty simple small hand where I was deciding whether or not to c-bet. And I had a weak value hand on a draw EV board. He didn't like that I bet. And I said, well, I know that my hand is going to be pretty good now against the range it's calling me. And on a lot of turns and rivers, it's going to be uncomfortable both facing bets, and I'm not going to find a lot of opportunities to value bet. This was like a top and middle pair or top and bottom pair in PLO on, let's say, a 9-7-3-2 hard board. My friend said to me, those reasons that you're giving, that it's going to be really uncomfortable on turns and rivers, not going to be a very strong hand on turns and rivers. When that's the case, your hand is not worthy of protection. In order to protection bet, you need to have a good enough hand that it's worthy of it. It's a bit of an oversimplification because there are so many factors at play, but I really liked that. That really spoke to me because it just changed the way I was evaluating the strength of my hand. And my last sticky note says, patience, some pots aren't mine. This is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, the way that it would come up for me is I would call a 3-bet in PLO. The flop would be, let's say, a low straight board. My opponent would check because it's a really bad board for his range, and I would have a terrible hand. And my thought process would be, well, if I check back, I'm not going to be able to represent it very well. I can only bet third pot and take it down against a bunch of different hands. Let's just try to win this pot. And what happens there, obviously, is my range gets way out of whack because I'm just betting all of my bluffs in that situation. And so my betting range has too many bluffs. My checking range doesn't have enough hands I can bluff later. Delayed aggression is something that I think I need to remind myself of sometimes. There are times that similarly, I'll make a read that my opponent's flop betting range is a little bit too weak. And rather than call in position with a hand that can call, I'll just go ahead and attack right now with a raise. Yet I'm not representing that many hands with a raise and actually calling and waiting to see if my opponent checks turn so that I can bet, or even have the turn go check and see if he checks river so that I can bet, is often going to be a higher EV line. This sticky note is there to remind me, don't think about how I can win this pot, think about how I can make the most money. And sometimes that means conceding the pot. I personally find these reminders really helpful, even though they're so simple, just like one of the reminders itself. Some people don't. Some people don't have sticky notes. They work in different ways. If you are one of those people and this wasn't helpful to you, I'm sorry to hear that, but hopefully it helped you. And for some of you, it gave you some insight into the way that I think through things, the problems that I struggle with in my game, and perhaps could give you some insight into some areas that you struggle with that you may not have realized. I appreciate everybody watching. Please consider subscribing.
Yeah, so I've had two mental game coaches throughout my career. Tommy Angelo first, and I started working with him back in 2006. And then more recently, I've worked with Elliot Rowe for several years. They're both fantastic. They're both actually very different in what they teach. Basically, Tommy teaches, parts of how to be professional from his own lived experience and how to be zen about poker as a whole, because it's something he has more or less achieved. Elliot is a lot more of, he's two things. He's a hypnotherapist and performance coach. And then he's also kind of like if you were running a business and you had an executive coach, he's something like that. So the advice is not as general as it is very specific to what you're dealing with. Recently, I recorded a video. This was top 5 bits of advice I'd gotten. And my one favorite one from Tommy that really stuck out, which I'm not going to put in this again because it's kind of cheating you out of one of your top 5, but I have to mention because it's so good, is basically a lesson in quitting and a mindset shift in quitting. I'm not going to go over the whole thing again, but you can check out the other video and you'll see it there. So for Tommy, I'm going to go, this is one that he actually didn't teach me directly. He wrote an article about it called Reciprocality. If you play a hand a certain way and your opponent would play the hand the same way, if roles were reversed, and you would play their hand the same way, they would play your hand the same way, you've gained no money. So yes, you might have gotten aces and they might have had kings, and you might have gotten all in pre-flop and you might have won $2,000 at 5-10 no limit. But in reality, nobody gained an edge because you both played it the way you would have played in each other's shoes. So the concept of reciprocality is that all edges come from you doing something better than what your opponent would have done in your shoes. So the way this applies is it helped get me to stop thinking about, it helped me stop being so focused on the exact situation and result of the hand that I'm in. And it helped me not worry as much about, oh, I lost this big pot with set over set, or, oh, I bluffed here and ran into the nuts, whatever the case may be, because I can think about in terms of kind of expected value and reciprocality of, oh, if my opponent had middle set there, they also would have gone broke. So I didn't actually lose any money there. I really like that approach. It's really just the concept of expected value and your earn, but put in a very eloquent and easy to understand way. So I've always liked that. So I worked with Elliot now. So we launched a course of his Run It Once, and I took that course. And this is something I actually learned mostly through the course and then talking with him a little bit. When No Limit Hold'em solvers came out, I was playing Limit Omaha. I didn't play No Limit Hold'em, so I never used them. Then Limit Omaha solvers came out. And at that point, I was still playing, but for the first year or two, I didn't touch them. I wasn't that interested, or like thought that I wasn't that interested. I was still, winning and doing well. And then I started to get more involved in my business in Run It Once training and Run It Once poker, and kind of actually turned into a full-time job. And so I took some time away from poker, and I was kind of playing very part-time. I realized back in 2019, through talking to Elliot and through doing his course, there's an exercise where you write out some things that you wish you could do better. My example in this case, I wish I would sit down and study with solvers, but I hadn't done it. And so it asks you to go through, why it is that you haven't done it, and kind of what is your fear. And I realized that my fear was, I've never been much of a studier. I was not a great student because I didn't do my homework. I didn't study, and I never developed good study habits. Even throughout my poker career, I studied a lot less than my opponents. And so I had this fear of trying and failing, essentially. So trying to study the solver and realizing I couldn't retain the information. I couldn't do it as well as my opponents. And I just I was afraid of learning that, maybe my poker career as I knew it, competing at the highest levels, was over. He took me through the exercise of, there's an acronym for it, I don't remember, but basically you write out what's the worst case scenario thing that would happen. I write out, I start to study, I'm just not getting it. I'm having a really hard time processing it and blah, blah, blah. And then he asks, well, what would you do if that happened? Essentially, you go through this exercise and simulate going through your worst fear in that situation, and simulate, what would happen? What would I do? What might happen next? What are some other outcomes? It just made me realize that first of all, that I was afraid to study with solvers. And second of all, that I should go for it. And if it went as badly as I feared, then so be it. I knew what I would do next. I knew I'd be okay. And that actually led me to studying with solvers and actually competing at very high levels in the Galfond challenges against top players and doing well. So the number 3, also from Elliot now. Elliot sometimes runs these group retreats of sorts. And this was, I think, the first one he did. It was here in Vegas, though. Essentially, this exercise, you get up in what he calls the hot seat and talk about whatever is kind of on your mind right now, that kind of your biggest hurdle. And then not only will he talk you through it, but other people who are there in, some similar careers, some different, will offer their advice or ask you questions. What I was going through, I was talking a lot about challenges I was facing with the business. In the back and forth, I started talking about playing poker, and, I missed playing poker. And everybody in the room, Elliot included, essentially their feedback to me was, you were talking about the business and it sounded really hard. It sounded like you were struggling. It sounded like you were not enjoying yourself. And then you started talking about poker and you lit up. And it was clear that poker to you is something that business is not. It's not about what potentially could lead to more success financially or what you think you should be doing. The fact of the matter is that you love to play poker. There's no way around that. And so it was actually the combination of these two things from Elliot. I made the decision from there to go from full-time working on the business to near full-time, for a little while at least, playing poker, and very part-time on the business and delegating a lot of my tasks to other people. And this is what led to eventually the idea of the Galfond Challenge, where I played against top players in Heads Up PLO and some of the matches on Run It Once so we could promote the business as well. Really, I kind of went from kind of thinking that, I had my time as a top player and it was really fun and I loved it, but I might be done with that. I might never be a top player again because the game has changed. Going from thinking that to actually becoming a top player again, which meant a lot to me, not only, financially, but emotionally, is an accomplishment that I'm really proud of and made me really happy. And so both of those kind of breakthroughs together led to that. And and had a big impact on my life. Nothing else stands out from Elliot like those two. And even nothing else from Tommy stands out like those two, because like I said, Tommy's are more realizations about the world and approaches he takes to poker. Yeah, one lesson that Tommy taught me is that everything has an impact on your edge, and that's actually something you can take advantage of, or that's actually something you can use to your advantage. So the example I think of is Tommy would always come to World Series of Poker during the summer, and Tommy was a cash game player. He didn't play any tournaments, but he loved to play cash games in the afternoons and evenings when the tournaments were running, because he would just be there playing his cash game in his normal mood. And a lot of people would play a tournament. They would bust out of the tournament and they would go head over to the cash games, because that's what you do. If you're a poker player, you don't have another tournament to play, you go play cash games. And he was just there in his normal state. And all of these players were coming from having just had an upsetting loss into his game right there. And so they're already coming in tilted in some capacity. Maybe some don't mind that much. Maybe some are really upset. Maybe some are just, slightly off balance and are going to, fall all the way over. But he's gaining an edge. Again, reciprocality. He's playing with no emotional baggage coming from tournaments, and these players are joining the table at a pretty bad time to play. Now, a lot of these players, just they're pros, they're still, favorites in the game, but he's getting an edge just by not having just dealt with a loss. And there are so many of these things that come up in poker where, with the concept of reciprocality, not just in terms of how hands are played, but in terms of how much preparation you've done, how much sleep you've gotten, what kind of mood you're in, there are a lot of ways to gain an edge, because if your opponent's tired and you're not, that's an edge. If your opponent's upset and you're not, that's an edge. And then the last one, I never used this, but I kind of wanted to. So I've never used this because I have too much trouble. It's not really lying, but lying. But it's a really funny tactic that he uses that I would really like to start using. So basically, when he's playing live poker, a lot of times after a hand, you'll bet the river, your opponent will fold, and they'll be like, "Did you make a flush?" Or, "You're bluffing, weren't you? You probably had a missed straight draw." First of all, it's just kind of annoying because you're not going to tell them and you don't want to deal with it. And second of all, if you do start to engage in that and you do tell them, you're actually losing an edge because you're giving them information for free. Now, there's a counter argument to this, which is like, in this conversation, you can get information from them about what they folded and how they think about the game. But anyways, it's still like a kind of something that can wear on you if you're playing a lot. And so what Tommy does is whatever they ask him, he just says yes. "Oh, did you make a flush?" "Yep." And then sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, did you make a flush?" And he'll be like, "Yep." And they'll ask him another question. Sometimes they'll ask a question that kind of isn't congruent with the first, and he says "yep" again, and then they're confused because it doesn't really make sense. And eventually, after hours of playing, sometimes they realize that he said yes every time that they've asked him if he had a certain hand. But that's something that I've always kind of wanted to do and haven't done. Hopefully you're comfortable doing it, because it does sound relaxing in those situations. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed those lessons. I'm super thankful to both Tommy and Elliot for everything they've taught me over the years. And I'm glad I could share a little bit of that with you.
All right, Phil, you don't know the top 5 topic I'm about to say. Today's actually comes from a question in our comments. I'd love to see a top 5 amendments to your past poker strategies.
Yeah, because there are actually a lot of ways that my strategy has shifted over the years, specifically because of solvers. I started playing poker 15 years ago. When there were no such thing as poker solvers. As they've come out, they've taught us some things about the way poker works that we didn't really understand. So let's see, reaching back. Okay, so number 5, continuation betting flop too often. And this applies to Hold'em, to PLO. It applies to single raise pots, to 3-bet pots. I remember when it was just like raise and then c-bet 90% of the time in Hold'em, or even in PLO, like 3-bet and then c-bet every time on the flop, which was terrible PLO strategy. I mean, I actually learned to not do that before solvers came out, but solvers further solidified the fact that you're not supposed to do that. There are some boards on which you can c-bet your full range, and there are several on which you definitely should not. Oh, number 4, 3-betting too polarized a range. So there were spots where, this is way back, facing an open and Hold'em, I would, let's say, 3-bet, queens, kings, aces, whatever, 3-bet strong hands. And then my bluffs, I would pull from like 8-5 suited and 10-4 suited. But then there were hands in between the two that I didn't play. Let's say 10-7 suited or Jack-8 suited, depending on the spot. Ace-4 suited, I would just call, for example. Whereas since I've learned that you want to first figure out, okay, are these hands good enough to play? And then from the hands that are good enough to play, decide which to 3-bet.
And in a lot of spots, you might, a lot of times you want to have a linear 3-betting or 4-betting strategy where it's just the best chunk of hands, but, a variety of different types of cards for board coverage or different like hand compositions for board coverage. Sometimes the 3-betting range is more polarized. Those situations occur when you have with calling range, basically. So there are some spots where people play 3-bet or fold, and there's no point in 3-betting 8-deuce suited when you're folding 8-5 suited. Like you just pick the better the hands that you're going to play and then 3-bet all of them, and you just pick from the best one. So that's a linear 3-betting range. But then there are some spots where, let's say you're defending the big blind against a middle position open. Well, now you have a lot of hands that you call with, and then your 3-bet actually can be more polarized. It depends on the spot and the stacks and blah, blah, blah. But there are a lot of situations where you do not want to polarize 3-bet range. I'm actually going to roll this into number 3. I used to love to raise with hands that were not good enough to call. And there are some spots where that's okay. But for the most part, what we learned from solvers is if it wasn't good enough to call, it's pretty unlikely that it's good enough to raise. That's more of a PLO thing than a limit thing, I think. But I think it's roughly, it holds true in a lot of scenarios at least. And I used to always take the approach of, all right, so my value raises, I know what those are. My bluffs, I'm going to pull from hands that are going to have to fold otherwise, but I can raise with them instead. So I don't do that as often anymore. Number 2 is using a lot more small bet sizes. The funny thing is, when you go back to like 15 years ago, and especially learning tournament strategy, you would just like raise and then you c-bet tiny, and then you bet turn pretty small. Like you actually would do a lot of small betting. And then for a while that got uncool, and you would do a lot more checking and then big betting with hands that want to bet. I mean, what we learned is basically you can't generalize. There are some boards on which you want to just small bet a ton of hands. There are other boards on which you only want to big bet. There's some boards on which you want to big bet a ton of hands based on range composition. But basically, small bets are a very, very important part of optimal poker strategy, especially from out of position. So basically, I think 10 years ago, small bets out of position were almost exclusively, they were to do one of two things. One, it was to just put a small amount in the pot so your opponent doesn't bet bigger. You want to stop your opponent from raising, or you want to induce your opponent to raise so you can then 3-bet because you have a huge hand. And now we've learned that, there's a much more blended, nuanced strategy that just involves a lot of small betting because, let's say, for example, you're leveraging a certain part of your range that you have an advantage in, and once you bet big, the kind of gap or deficiencies in your opponent's range don't matter anymore because they have the hands to defend against big because they don't have to defend as many. But if you defend small, or if you bet small, they have to defend so many hands that they get into some really uncomfortable spots based on the makeup of their range. And also, it's just like if you want to get value across 2 streets for small sizing, you have certain hands that can do that. But once they start betting big, they're no longer good enough to value bet. Anyways, there are a lot of spots like that where it comes up. So number 2, small betting. Number 1 is an interesting one because so number 1 is game flow, the concept of game flow. Game flow means, you could call it kind of metagame, but it's not overall metagame. It's in the moment game flow, what's been happening. Game flow is essentially, I haven't turned c-bet in a long time, so I think my opponent's going to believe me if I c-bet flop and turn. Game flow is still a thing, but over the years, I've come to learn, well, first of all, against players who are studying theory, it's much less of a thing. They're not too concerned with game flow. And second of all, as I play against players who are just focused purely on playing theoretically optimally, you notice a lot of things that feel like game flow and feel like people are adjusting in certain ways when actually it's just the run of cards that they're getting or the run of cards on the board. So I think interpreting game flow and utilizing it to my advantage is something that I've stopped doing much. There are still times where, a player's losing and they've just called like a big river bet. They've just called a big river check raise and they've been wrong both times. And you can tell they're really frustrated and they feel stupid doing so. I think they're going to be unlikely to put themselves in a tough spot or unlikely to call a big river bet again, depending on the player, but because they don't want to feel stupid again. Similarly, if they just got caught with like a big bluff, they don't want to go for a big bluff again, feel stupid again, don't want to risk feeling stupid again because then the check raise becomes about more than just risking the money. It's also risking the emotional pain that comes along with it. An interesting thing that I'm reminded of, and if you've watched all of my videos, I've probably told this story before, that combines game flow and, raising hands that can't call, was the most memorable hand I've played. I was playing heads up for a bracelet. It was 25K World Series Poker 6-max tournament. And I hadn't raised a flop in a really long time. And I just decided to raise complete airball on flop. And I'm going to make up the board to get roughly the idea. King, Jack, 4. And I check raise like 8-5 offsuit because of game flow, which is something I wouldn't do anymore. But I hadn't raised in a while. I thought he'd be very believable. And so I raised. Turn was a 10. So completed a bunch of draws. And because every like flop draw got there, I was like, he's going to believe me and just fold a bunch of stuff. So I bet turn something like half pot. And I have about a pot size bet left on the river, which I have him barely covered, I think. Or maybe he has me barely. Anyways, the stacks were close. And he actually min raises the turn. And I can't call out of position with 8 high. The only play is go all in or fold. And I really didn't think that he would raise a good hand. Like, I just didn't believe that he would raise a good hand there because it just looks like I'm going to go all in on the river. So why would you prevent me? Like, I'm young at this point. I have an aggressive image. I'm the online guy. And my opponent played online. It was Steve Sung. He played online, but he came from a live background and strong player. But yeah, I just thought there's no way that, like, if he has a good hand, he's just going to let me keep bluffing. He wants to let me keep bluffing. So why would he raise? I tanked with 8 high, no draw. Like, I've never gone all in on the turn, or flop, like gone all in with cards to come with 0 equity when called. I always had like, a gut shot or something, a flush draw. I'd never done it before. And I just felt really believed that it would work, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And actually a little bit of of what I just talked about, this wasn't game flow related, but there's a lot of emotional pain that goes along with like making a play, like a just complete kamikaze bluff like that, and just getting called and feeling really stupid for a really long period of time. So I ended up folding. I couldn't do it. I saw on the stream afterwards, he actually had like a weak top pair, and I'm pretty sure it was raise folding because he didn't want to face the river bet, which is what I suspected. If he had a big hand, he wanted to let me bet river. And so that I ended up losing, and that's my only second place in the World Series Poker. And so that hand was very memorable. It would have been like, had I shoved, I would have had 80% of the chips in play, and instead I was at a like 60-40 or 70-30 chip disadvantage and did not win. So if I could go back and play that now, I guess actually I wouldn't have check raised the flop. But had I check raised the flop and bet the turn, I think I probably would have gone with it. Trusted my read. I guess that wasn't one of the 5 things listed, but we'll make that the bonus number 0, which is that over time, and this just comes with experience and having a relatively successful poker career, I've learned to trust my reads. And I've had enough of those spots where I've done something crazy and been right, and some where I've done something crazy and been wrong. But I've had so many spots I've been right more often than not, so that if I make a guess like that and it doesn't work out, I don't beat myself up over it. I just say, well, usually when I have a feeling that strong, I'm right. This time I wasn't. I can move on. That's our top 5 plus walk down memory lane. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.
So top 5 poker pot odds mistakes.
I think I'm just going to go with 1. So I think that far and away, the biggest mistake you can make at kind of all levels, not just beginner, when it comes to pot odds, has to do with equity realization. So there's your equity, and then there's how much of your equity you realize. So what do I mean by that? Let's say that, whatever, you have ace queen, I have 5s, I have 52% equity or something. But when you raise the cutoff and I call in the big blind, am I going to realize all of that equity? Maybe, maybe not. Being out of position, you realize less equity. And with certain categories of hands, you realize less equity. So the areas where this really comes into play, it's more often in like
So I guess I think of it a lot in PLO terms because I'm a PLO player, but every hand pre-flop has decent equity. Like the worst hands in PLO against some of the best hands in PLO will still have 35% equity. And you're defending the big blind getting 2-1. So according to your pot odds, you can call with everything. But obviously we don't do that. And the reason for that is equity realization or implied odds and reverse implied odds. They're all kind of the same thing. So when you have a hand that is likely to flop, turn, and river hands that can do a lot of betting and a lot of calling, then you have good implied odds. You have good equity realization. If you have a hand that is not going to be able to do a lot of betting, not going to be able to do a lot of raising on a lot of flops, turns, and rivers, and has to do a lot of folding, then you have poor equity realization or reverse implied odds. So in Hold'em, a good example of this is, middle position raises and it's folded to you in the small blind and you have ace 7 offsuit. You're like, well, if he doesn't have a pair or ace high, I have the best hand. And even if he has, if he has king, queen suited, I have the best hand. If he has kings, I have whatever that is, 30% equity, which is not that bad. But the problem is when you flop an ace and a lot of money goes into the pot, oftentimes you're going to be up against a bigger ace, you're going to lose a big pot. And when you don't flop an ace, let's say Jack 10-3 is the flop, you're going to check fold and sometimes check fold the best hand and not get to realize all of that equity. So for example, let's say your opponent has king queen, the flop is Jack 9-3, you check, your opponent bets, you fold, you folded something like 60 to 65% equity right then. And so not like you had 55% pre-flop, you called. On the flop, you had 65% equity and you folded. And that's going to happen very often. You have a hand that doesn't flop a lot of draws, doesn't flop a lot of like very strong mate hands. And so looking at just your pot odds and what your equity is against your opponent's range is a mistake or rather is a mistake in the way of looking at things that leads to mistakes in the way you play your hands. And this concept carries over street to street. So sometimes, you'll have a drawing hand that, based on the bet size that you're facing right now, could call. But you have to keep in mind that you're going to face future bets. You might not realize your equity because you have to fold the turn, not getting to see the river card, or you have a weakish draw where when you do hit, you don't have implied odds, you have reverse implied odds because your opponent's going to have a stronger flush reasonably often. For example, you see this a lot in limit games. So like 7-card stud, pre-flop, you're getting whatever, 4-1, 3-1. You could play so many hands if the hand ended right there. But the problem is there are, 5 more streets of betting or something in 7-card stud. So if you want to actually see your way all the way to 7th street, you're going to need to put in another bet and another bet and another bet. And so your true odds are a lot worse than they seem. So yeah, keep in mind that, keep an eye on hands that realize their equity poorly, because again, they don't flop or turn or river things that want to put in a lot of money. And they're more often doing the check calling and guessing and hoping and hanging on. And then other hands where you don't quite have the equity to call. Let's say that you flop a nut flush draw with ace deuce of spades on king 7-5 and whatever, your opponent bets 2x pot and they show you that they have king 7. You don't have the odds to call there because you're something like 33% equity. Actually, that's a bad maybe they pot and they show you 2 pair. Regardless, you don't have the odds to call because, you're going to hit your flush on the turn, whatever, 16, 17% of the time. And then they're going to keep betting, you're going to fold. But when you do hit your flush, you're going to make a lot more money and you're going to be able to put in a lot of money. So in that case, and if this is again a bad example because they've shown you that they have 2 pair, but in practice, in spots where, they can have weaker flush draws as well, and you could win huge pot when you hit. Same thing is true of like playing, small pocket pairs, multi-way, or heads up, but like especially multi-way where, pocket threes, it does not have great equity against 4 other hands. But when you do hit your 3, you can win a big pot. Those are hands that over-realize their equity. And of course, out of position, you realize less of your equity. In position, you realize more of your equity, which is why you get to play more hands in leader position. Hopefully that's helpful for some of you. And you keep that in mind as you make your pre-flop hand selections and decide what to continue with on the flop as well.
Everybody wants to know how to adjust to a Maniac. And the answer is, it depends. There are different types of Maniacs. And yes, at the very beginning of playing with somebody, you might be able to tell from observing a few hands that they're just putting a lot of money into pots. But you don't have more specifics at that point. And we'll talk about that. But what I want to do today is give 3 kind of more concrete, specific examples of a type of Maniac. And I've come up with ones that I think are, like that I've seen before that are kind of reasonable characters. And then I'll talk about how I would adjust. So first, I'll start with somebody who, he likes to put in a lot of money on each street. He does this by over bluffing. He also does this by just kind of ramming in too much money with pretty good hands. Doesn't overfold, certainly, underfolds, but is not, he's not clueless. He's not check calling flop with no pair, no draw, no hope. But when he's got a little bit of equity, or he senses weakness, or whatever the case may be, he pounces. He's doing so with huge bets, huge raises. The first and most important thing to keep in mind against this kind of player is when they check to you, if you bet, you are opening the door for them to put in a huge check raise. So what's the most obvious adjustment that we make? Well, we bet with a range that is more polarized, because a polarized range likes being raised. If we start going thinly for value, that's a range that does not like being raised. So on the flop, we're going to bet our sets. We're going to bet our top 2 pair, depending on we're going to bet our straights. We're going to bet our flushes, etc. We're going to bet our very strong hands, and then we're going to bet some bluffs. Now, this opponent is probably not going to overfold, like I said. So we don't want to bluff too much, but you bluff occasionally, obviously. This opponent is not clueless. If they see you just always betting, like always having the nuts when you bet, they're going to catch on. They're going to stop shoveling in 200 big blinds against you. So we need to bluff a little bit. Now, once we check back and we get to the turn, kind of similar logic. Basically, we don't want to open the door for this player to check bomb to whatever 6x pot. So once again, we're betting a pretty polarized range. And what this ends up meaning is that, first of all, we're checking back some decently strong hands that we would normally not check back twice to keep the pot small and go for value on the river. It also means that we're missing some bluffs that have reasonably high equity because we don't want to get blown off that equity, or we don't want to be forced to put in a ton of money with like the wrong amount of equity. But that's okay. I think oftentimes people don't like this approach, or they feel like they're playing too weak by, I'm not making enough money with my top pair weak kicker. I'm not making enough money with second pair. I'm not making enough money with a weak over pair. That's not how you beat this player. I mean, it can be, and obviously, if we want to get more specific into how they play, maybe it is. Maybe you start delay c-betting turn with some of these hands that, you get put in a tough spot when they check raise, but they're only check raising 10% of the time. It's not 30% of the time, whatever the case may be. It depends how kind of crazy they are. But this player is going to lose money to you. The types of mistakes they're making, they're going to lose money to you when you have a good hand, and they're putting in way too much money, both with bluffs and with value hands. So you don't have to do anything. The way that you exploit them is actually just relaxing. You don't have to like outmaneuver them. Like, they check raise flop, and maybe they've got too many thin value hands and too many bluffs, and now you want to attack that range. And sure, you can do some of that, but the way to really beat them is not get into that spot in the first place. So against this player, polarized flop c-betting range, polarized turn betting range. We're just only betting with hands that don't mind getting raised for the most part, and take it from there. Obviously, you'll get to the river with some hands, like you'll get a lot of check bets. You'll have some strong value hands that can check bet, and if they check raise the river, you deal with it. But you haven't let them use maximum leverage against that portion of your range. When they're using maximum leverage by check bombing flop or turn, you've got a strong hand, and that's where you're going to make your money. So let's talk about Maniac number 2. Maniac number 2 forces in way too much money with good hands, with weak top pair, and sometimes
open-ender plus flush draw, sure. But they're not bluffing that much. They just, they call your 3-bet with 9s and you're 200 big blinds deep and the flop is 8-7, 3, two-tone, and you c-bet half pot and they like 5x raise with 9s to get in 200 big blinds. That's this kind of player. They're just putting in a ton of money with pretty good hands and better. The easiest and most obvious adjustment to this player is once they put in a lot of money, fold unless you have a hand that beats a good portion of their value range. This player is going to, once again, lose money to you. Like when you have a very good hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're going to just give you all the money. They're going to make it easy on you. When you have a marginal hand and they have a pretty good hand, they're also going to make it easy on you because they're going to force in all the money. And now it's your job to just fold middle pair. It's your job to fold these hands that are just pure bluff catchers against a range that's not bluffing enough. Not only not bluffing enough, but then having way too many value bets, which means proportionally they're almost never bluffing. They make it pretty easy. And actually against this type of opponent, you can do some bet folding with value hands. Now it's kind of tricky because you don't want to get into a spot where they check jam turn for 5x pot and you have a hand that beats like, 5% or 10% of their value range, because you still have to fold that because 90% of the time you're losing. But it is unfortunate that you kind of like get bluffed off the best hand by a value hand. So be a little careful with those hands. But actually you can kind of do some more like thin value / protection betting on the turn with like second pair that just has a very clear fold to the raise because they're not bluffing enough. And now another thing to keep in mind is when this player check calls on the flop and or turn, remember that they are kind of ramming money in with thin value. So when they call, they don't have that thin value that they're supposed to have in their calling range. So now their range is weakened and you can bluff a decent amount. Actually, probably this type of opponent's going to overfold turns and overfold rivers because they're putting in so much money early with good hands. So yeah, this opponent, you don't have to take the same approach as Maniac number 1. It's actually a much different approach, even though both of them at the very beginning might present like players that are playing kind of the same way. So let's talk about Maniac number 3. Maniac number 3 loves to bluff. If you give this player rope, they're just going for it. Anytime they kind of get to the river with a hopeless hand and a big pot, if you give them a chance to bluff, they will. They love to, raise flop with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to raise turn with weak semi-bluffs, strong semi-bluffs. They like to bluff the river when checked too. They like to bluff the river against small bets too, as well. This type of player usually doesn't like bluff raise river against big bets. They like to attack weakness, or they'll find themselves on the river with air because they bet twice, or like they c-bet flop, you check call, turn goes check check, and now something hits on the river and they can't help themselves. Or they check called flop and turn goes check check, and now they can't help, whatever the case may be. Oftentimes like they'll bluff raise flop. So the flop is 10-8-3, they're in position, you bet, they raise with like every gut shot, then you call, and then the turn is a king and it goes check check. Well, now they've started a bluff, but they've kind of given up on the turn because they don't like the turn. But now that they are checked to again on the river and they can't win by checking, they like to bet. So that's kind of the most obvious adjustment, is make sure that in a spot where it's very likely that they have air, give them rope, let them bluff you. Kind of similar to Maniac number 1, and a little bit the case with Maniac number 2. We never want to slow play. We want to bet kind of polarized. We want to bet all of our strong hands. And we want to be a little bit careful with hands that have to that are in an uncomfortable spot against a check raise, basically. So like decent semi-bluff hands that really don't want to bet fold their equity. Even on like that 10-8-3 flop, a hand like King Queen, King Jack with a backdoor flush draw and all those backdoor straight draws, like you don't want to get check raised off of that by their 6-7 and all that stuff. So check more of those hands that have some hope and like some good turn cards. You can still bluff on the flop, of course, and this player, it starts to get. So what you're supposed to do is you actually still bet the right number of value hands, potentially even a little thinner, maybe not. And then when they check raise, you just grit your teeth and you call down or you get the money in. A lot of people don't have the stomach for that, and so you actually can probably get 80%, 90% of the EV against this player
by skipping those plays, just checking the flop when you're pretty uncomfortable to face a check raise and call down, you're going to make more money if you're right about this read by betting flop and calling down. But you're not making a ton of money. They have better hands, they have draws that have reasonable equity against you. So yes, you're supposed to be betting and calling down because they're over bluffing, over semi bluffing, and barreling through often. But if you skip some of those plays, you're not going to lose that much EV as long as you're betting the quite strong hands. That's where they're just going to punt off the money to you. This type of player actually, when they check call, they more often have a made hand than a draw. I mean, it depends how loose they are. Sometimes they just call with, like high card and backdoor draws because they're super loose. Or other times they check raise so many of their draws, and when they check call, they have middle pair or top pair. So hand read accordingly. And, against this player, let's just use the same 10-8-3 board. You see bet flop, they call, turn pairs the 8. Against some opponents, bluffing, whatever, 7-6 works out well because they have to check fold their queen jacks and their flush draws and things like that. Against this player, that they probably raised a lot of those hands on the flop. So now actually they hit the 8 pretty hard, and they have like 10s and 8s pretty often as well. So those semi bluffs on the turn aren't going to work as well against them. But yeah, most of the money comes from betting good hands and then letting them give you a lot of money when you've got a good hand. And then the last one, which I think I touched on, but when you get to those river spots where they're likely to have air, make sure you're not betting big. You can bet small to try to induce bluffs, or you can check to try to induce bluffs, but look for those spots to induce bluffs on the river rather than going for kind of thin value. Generally speaking, obviously hand read, every situation is different. Use your poker abilities. Don't just blindly follow this strategy against anyone who loosely fits this description on every board texture. But yeah, that's how I would approach it. Generally, when you sit down at the table and somebody's clearly putting a lot of money into the pot, but you haven't figured out which kind of maniac they are, just play tight ranges and polarized ranges. So again, assume that you're going to get raised too frequently and bet hands that are comfortable getting raised, whether they're, bluffs that can just bet fold or very strong hands that want to get raised. And as you play with this player over time, pay attention to their showdowns, see if it seems like they're the over bluffing type or if they're just ramming in too much money with pretty good hands, and then you can make the adjustments I talked about in the video. If there's another type of maniac that you've had trouble with, let me know in the comments.
All right, Phil. So top 5 poker mistakes you're making.
Okay. That's not that bad of a top 5. That's a pretty good top 5. So top 5 poker mistakes you're making. Number 1 is easy. Number 1 is you're not thinking about why you make the plays that you make. So perhaps you read a pre-flop chart and it says, open ace jack plus from this position and pocket 9s are better and king queen suit, whatever. And you're doing that. And then you get to the flop and you flop a pair and you just bet. And then the turn comes and you just bet. And if I sat you down and asked you, why did you bet the flop? You'd say, well, because I had top pair, or well, because I raised pre-flop. And what's important is you start thinking about the purpose of all of your bets and raises, what they're trying to accomplish. And it goes back to pre-flop. The whole game starts pre-flop, and it starts from the blinds and or the antes. If there were no blinds or antes, there's no reason to play any hand that's not aces, which makes for a really boring game because you can just wait for aces and never lose any money. But the blinds and antes give you something to fight over. So why you play a hand pre-flop is in part to win the blinds, and then to open with a range of hands that, because people are forced to fight for the blinds, they can defend hands that you can get value against, etc. Wow. There's a fly in here. I have to kill the fly.
No flies.
It's right on the mic too. All right, I'm gonna get a fly. Okay, so back to the question. I was talking about point 1, which was think about why you're doing what you're doing. And I said starting from pre-flop, there's reasons for playing all the hands that you play. And then going on to post-flop, are you betting because you want to get value? you want to get called by a worse hand? Are you betting because you want to fold out a worse hand than yours or a hand with equity against yours? And then as you progress through the hand, there are a lot of things to think about. And your thinking can start out on a beginner level. It'll get more advanced the more you play. But the most important thing is that you are thinking, and you could answer that question if I asked you, why did you do that? Doesn't matter at the beginning if your answers are terrible and your plays are terrible. If you're thinking about why you're doing what you're doing, you're on the path towards getting better. So that's one. Number two follows from one pretty closely, and it's you're not thinking about why your opponent is doing what they're doing. So a lot of people will, maybe they know like, okay, this guy plays every hand. So you can get reads on your opponents, but go further than that. Think about why they're making the plays that they're making and whether they are a strong player with a very conscious, logical thought process, or a weak player with, some kind of maybe base framework of a strategy and then a lot of emotional leaks that lead to their decisions. Or really, when you don't have a sound strategy, your decisions are ultimately guided by emotion, whether you know it or not. And so thinking about, this player is making this bet, what does he hope to accomplish? And why does he want to accomplish that? And from there, as you get more advanced, you think, okay, well, this just happened. I saw this player do this and this. So it seems like, maybe they're afraid to play a big pot with a marginal hand, or it seems like they're maybe really excited to bluff a lot. And so you can start to get a kind of a psychological profile is making it out to be more than it is. But that's what I came up with. So you're starting to build a psychological profile for these unsubs, and that'll help you kind of figure out, why they're making the decisions they make as you go on, and how you can adjust to that. So that's 1 and 2. That was easy. 3. I guess I'll follow on from 2. 3 is that you're making decisions purely out of emotion. A lot of people make decisions out of fear. A lot of people make decisions out of comfort. I would say comfort is the number one. We're moving on to the top 5 types of emotions that make people make bad plays. But comfort is the number one thing that kind of dictates the way that people play their hands, and people are comfortable with different things, and that's why it's important to get to know them. But a lot of people will, for example, overplay a good hand early because they're afraid of a scary turn card coming, when what they should do is, bet a smaller amount, perhaps slow play based on, what the board texture is and what the action is. And yes, that means they might end up losing the hand because that scary card might come and it might improve their opponent. But mathematically, on average, what happens more often is that they gain more value when they have the best hand. And so there are a lot of things like that where people, just rush to make the comfortable play, whether it be, I have the best hand now, I'm going to take down the pot, and that's all I want. I just want to win the hand. Or similarly, even if you're bluffing, like some people get really attached to raising and c-betting, or c-betting like middle pair when they should be checking because it's really comfortable to c-bet. They bet and their opponent calls, then they can kind of shut down. Their opponent raises, they can fold. Their opponent folds, great, they win the pot. But you're not accomplishing as much. You're not getting as much money from weaker hands, and you're not folding out any stronger hands. So try to become aware of your emotions and stop making plays strictly based on them. Number 4, you're playing outside of your means. A lot of people way underestimate variance in poker, and are playing games where they have a few buy-ins. And if you're playing recreationally and you're like, what, I'm going to the casino with $500, and if I lose it, I lose it, and that's only 1 buy-in to the game you want to play, 2 buy-ins to the game you want to play, that's fine. That's your decision. But if you want to play kind of longer term, whether it be semi-professionally or aspiring to be semi-professional and trying to break even for a while, you need to give some serious consideration to bankroll management. And essentially, the long and short of it is you need a lot more money than you think you need to withstand variance, even if you're a favorite in the game. And rounding out the list, okay, number 5, you're caring too much about what other people think of you at the table. A lot of people are embarrassed to make a river bluff that gets called and look stupid, or embarrassed to make a fold and get shown a bluff in front of everybody. Don't worry about people at the table judging how you play, especially if you're a good player. It's a good thing if people think you play badly. It's a great thing. People are going to make more mistakes against you. They're going to want to play with you more. And so you get more action. It's just, it's better if people have misinformation about how you play. Then there's no value in them thinking you're great unless you happen to own a training site and teach people how to play poker. But generally speaking, it's fine. It's fine if people think you're bad. Just embrace it and make the plays that you think you should make with no fear of judgment from other people, because what they think doesn't matter. It's your money to do with what you want.
Top 5 tips and tricks to never lose ever again.
Top 5 tips and tricks to never lose ever again, right? Okay. That's a bad one. I mean, it's basically don't play anything, and then you'll never lose ever again. And otherwise, you're out of luck because you're going to lose.
Top 5 hands that people play that should be folded.
Okay,
or stop playing these hands now.
Yeah. So this is a bad top 5 list that I'm still going to try to do my best to salvage. This is a question that you get asked. You also get asked by beginners, hey, so I'm playing in this tournament and I raised with 10s, and then the guy next to me, he just went all in. So what would you do? And the reason that is a bad question is because you've given none of the variables. I don't know what stack sizes are, what the blinds are, how much you open to, how much you went all in for. And so there's no answer. And this is kind of similar in that based on the game dynamics or variables, there are always hands that you might want to play, and then always hands that, you never really want to fold aces except for in a pretty extreme scenario. But those do exist, actually. And so there's no way to answer realistically, these are hands that you're playing that you shouldn't. What I can say, and I'll do my best, let me think this through a little bit, because I need to get to 5. So I'm primarily a PLO player, and all of my examples in No Limit, I'm not that confident in. So I'm just going to talk about it in PLO. So these are the top 5 hand categories in PLO that you are overplaying, essentially. So I've changed the question quite a bit, but here we go. So 1 is 2-pair. So flop 2-pair in PLO, especially with, or it's not especially, primarily and exclusively with no backup, no redraws, no flush draw to go with it, no gut shot, no backdoor strong flush draw and overcards, things like that. It's a hand people way overplay. It's not that top 2-pair even, for putting a lot of money in, is not a very good hand. So on a board like Queen 10-6 with 2 spades, if you have, Queen 10 5-4 with no spades, and you're facing a bet. Now again, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes laying out the scenario, but it's basically never a raising hand unless you're able to raise all in. So yeah, essentially even top 2-pair in a lot of scenarios is just not that good. when significant money is going in. And top and bottom pair or bottom two pair in PLO are pretty awful hands, actually, when they have no backup on a dynamic board, like the one described. So play those passively and cautiously. Don't be going broke with two pair in PLO for, 10 times the pot. Just don't do it. Number two, weak flush draws and flushes. Especially if you're playing, a full ring game or even a 6-max game, people's preflop ranges contain so many nut and second nut flush hands, so suited aces or suited kings, that, when you flop a 10 high flush draw and a lot of money is going in, you want to avoid a lot of money going in because you're just going to be dominated in both, the draw category and often the hand category. And so a big mistake that I see people make, especially when they come from Hold'em to PLO, is they flop middle pair, weak gut shot, and a weak flush draw, and they're just like, let's get all the money in, because in Hold'em, that's a great draw. Pair plus flush draw is huge. So that's second, and it leads into the third, which is same thing with weak straight draws and straights. Drawing to the third nut straight is a lot worse than it seems. Yes, you have you can have 8 outs to, usually you'll have 8 outs and 4 of them are to the nuts and the other 4 are to the third nuts. Or perhaps you have a gut shot that's just to the third nuts or second nuts. That's not worth that much in terms of how you value your hand and how you decide how much money to put in. Number 4 is overpairs. A lot of people will 3-bet, ace, ace, king, 5, single suited, and then the flop is jack, 9, 4 with a suit different than theirs, and then they just, they've got 2 callers and they just bet. You don't want to be forcing money into the pot. You don't need to c-bet just because you 3-bet or because you raise pre-flop, and a dry overpair with no chance to really improve to a big hand is not a good hand. And so I think that to sum up all of the ones so far, in PLO, you need to think about how good your hand is going to be on the river. Don't just think about, okay, I flopped top 2 pair, it's probably the best hand now. Or, okay, I flopped an overpair, it might be the best hand now. Or, okay, I have a pair and a flush draw, so, my equity against an overpair is good. It's, by the time the river comes, how often is my hand going to be a hand I want to put a lot of money in with? And if the answer is very rarely, you don't want to build a big pot. I'll move on to 5. So the last category, which I think is it's stronger than all the other ones I've talked about, but deceptive in that way, that it's still overplayed, is weak trips. So, the flop is king 8-8, and, it goes 3-way to the flop, and you have, 10-9-8-7. So you've 3 of a kind. It's a good hand, certainly. But by the time a lot of money is going in, it becomes not a good hand anymore. And I think one thing that people underestimate in PLO is how often somebody flops trips or better. So, it's hard to flop a set in PLO, just combinatorically. But with trips, it's not that hard. So I'm going to get the math wrong off the top of my head, but I think it's something like on a flop like 8-8 king, depending on pre-flop ranges, it might be like 15% likely that your opponent's flop trips. If you have one of them, there's only one more 8 out. So I'm just going to do the very bad math in my head. It's basically a little over 2% for each card your opponent has, which is 4, that they've got that one out. So we'll call it 8.5%, 9% chance that one of your opponents has trips. And when there are 2 opponents in the hand, then it becomes, 16% or 15% that one of them has trips. And then probably 2% based on pre-flop ranges, maybe, or even as high as 3%, that each of them might have king for top boat. So now you're looking at almost 25% chance that your 10, 9, 8, 7 is beat before any money goes in. And so now if you're talking about, well, you bet flop big and get a call, and then you bet turn big and get a call, your hand's probably not good anymore. Studies show that 80% of our thoughts are negative. I believe that that's going to vary from person to person. And I believe that people who express more negativity externally and internally are going to have more trouble at the poker table. So I'm going to talk you through why I believe that is and what you can do about it. In 2011, I moved to Vancouver, Canada to continue playing online poker when they shut it down. It was the first time I'd ever lived with a poker playing friend, an extended period of time. I'd spent some summers with groups of friends, but this is the first time I've been in the same house or apartment. We had no office in our apartment, so we both set up our computers on opposite ends of a very big kitchen table, and that's where we played from. And both of us were generally mild-mannered, non-expressive people. If you had a camera right here while I was playing, if I wasn't streaming or something else, you wouldn't see much of a reaction from me when anything happens. And he was kind of the same way. But all of a sudden, because there was another person in the room, we kind of slowly developed a habit of complaining about bad beats. So he would lose a pot and be like, oh man, that was sick. And I would do the same thing. And it actually kind of escalated over time where it just became normal for us to, essentially whine about losing pots. What I realized after a little while of that is I was actually getting tilted a lot more easily. And somehow expressing the emotion or complaining about being unlucky was impacting me in some way. And so I did a lot of thinking about why that was. So another friend that I'd spent summers with in Las Vegas, he would lose a pot online. He would get mad. He would throw his mouse at the wall, shatter. He would try to put it back together, but usually he could put it back together. The batteries had flown out and he could put it back together, but sometimes he broke the mouse. And then he was fine. He would throw it and then he was fine. There are some people who, when they have anger or something resembling anger, they get it out and it kind of releases it and they feel better. First of all, I'm not that kind of person. But second of all, what we were doing was not so much releasing anger, it was more just complaining. I believe that what all the complaining was doing was making me remember the unlucky events more readily. So it started to feel like I was unluckier than I was. When you feel like you're unlucky, when you've been on a long, extended bad run, you can start to get knocked off your game more easily because you're a little more emotionally unstable. You have this story that you're telling yourself that you're unlucky. Then you tell yourself, no, that's not a real thing. Everybody's luck going forward is going to be even, and I'm going to run normal from here on out. And so you're doing okay for a while, you're mentally okay, and then you lose again, and you're like, you fall back into that mindset of, no, I'm unlucky, and this is really upsetting. In college, I was taught about something called the shampoo effect. When you wash your hair with shampoo, you use whatever amount of shampoo, you lather, you rinse, and if you want to shampoo again, only a small amount of shampoo will get you as much lather. They use that to refer to drinking. If you went out one night drinking and you want to drink the next morning, you get drunk pretty quickly off of a couple of drinks. And I think the same thing is true of tilt. It becomes easier for a couple of bad beats to tilt you in a way that it used to take a dozen bad beats to do. So when I realized that, I stopped complaining as much, and he happened to stop complaining as much too. And I do think it genuinely helped. So there's something called a negativity bias. And the way this works, this is not exclusive to poker by any means. It's everywhere. If you've ever had to pick a line at the grocery store, you go into the one that seems the shortest, and then the one next to you that had like one extra person in it is just moving much faster, and it goes right past you. That kind of sticks in your mind, and you start to think, this always happens to me. Whereas if you get in the shortest line and then it goes the fastest, you don't think anything of it. That's just what was supposed to happen. Same thing happens in traffic. As soon as I move to this lane, that one's going to start moving and this one's going to stop, because those events stick out in your memory more than what is supposed to happen of you move to this lane because it's moving and it keeps moving. That happens everywhere. It can be really detrimental to your mental, emotional well-being. We've all had friends who will say something like, well, with my luck, this is what's going to happen. Why do these things always happen to me? I'm so unlucky. Things like that. I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, those people tend to be people who seem less happy more often. Now, obviously, you could argue that if somebody's having bad thing after bad thing happen to them, they're supposed to be unhappy. A lot of times it's their view of how the world is treating them, in my opinion. Not only can feeling like you're unlucky or being unlucky so many times tilt you more easily. It can also make you shy away from risks, both at the table while you're in a hand. I think this is a shove, but with my luck, I'm going to run into a big hand. I think this is a call, but the flop's going to be nasty for me. I'll just fold now and not have to deal with it. Or off the table in terms of playing in a game that you should because it's making you uncomfortable. You think you won't run well. Although with that specific example, don't play in a game if it's starting to make you feel uncomfortable, usually, because you'll play worse than you would otherwise. It can impact your EV in one way or another. It impacts your happiness level, which, what's more important than that? How do we counteract negativity bias? There are ways to not let it impact you as much. So one of the first is doing kind of the opposite of what my friend and I were doing. Rather than complain about the bad things that happen, celebrate when the good things happen. I'm not one when I'm playing to do either very much naturally, but celebrating the good things happening, make those more memorable. And celebration is a good feeling. It makes you feel good. I had a friend who taught me he was trying to help me, taught me a concept, and I just couldn't really execute it because of my personality. But basically what he does is he sets, I feel like it was every 3 hours, what he calls a joy alarm. And so his joy alarm goes off and he sits there and he asks himself some questions. I wish I remember all the questions he asked, but it's something along the lines of, am I financially secure? Do I have people who love me? And he goes through the list, and usually there are things that he does have. And then he essentially celebrates as if, you're in a bar and your team just won. And I couldn't get comfortable with with that. So I didn't incorporate it into my life. I tried a couple times. I'm glad there wasn't a camera on when I was. But the concept stuck with me. And I still tried to, in my own way, in my own less expressive way, celebrate when good things happen to me. Another one is to express gratitude. It's along the same lines, really. You can give thanks in a written form or a verbal form to yourself, or, if you pray to God, or to the people and things that you're grateful for. I don't know all the scientific reasons why that's so helpful, but if you're expressing gratitude for things and you're celebrating wins, you're going to remember all of the good things that are happening to you more than you would have otherwise. And another one is to do the opposite of what that friend I mentioned earlier does. So this is one that I do. I call myself a lucky person. So let's say that I'm going to buy a piece of somebody who's playing in a big tournament. I'll buy 10% of their action. And I'll say, don't worry, my money's lucky. And I don't actually believe that me investing in them is going to make them more lucky. I like to say it both for myself and why do I like to do that? I mean, objectively, I'm a lucky person. I was born in America to a loving family who are financially secure, who took great care of me. I've had great friends. I've had a great career. I have a great family now. I'm objectively a lucky person, and I know that I'm lucky, and I appreciate all of that. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be lucky in the future. Yet, I still like to say that I think I will be. And I think it just helps with mindset. It can kind of drag you down if somebody around you is always complaining or always not believing in themselves, not believing good things are going to happen to them. I think it makes me a more pleasant person to be around. To sum up, if you're the type of person that expresses anger and it helps you get it out, go for it by all means. But make sure you're celebrating wins as well. And if you're not that kind of person, or if you are, there's a difference between in the moment letting out your anger and 2 hours later complaining to your friend about how unlucky you were. Try to minimize those behaviors. They're bad for you. They're not helping your friend, certainly. And yeah, celebrate your wins, express gratitude. And you don't have to do this, but it works for me. I like to consider myself lucky. By the way, if you're enjoying this and you want to see more, imagine you're deep in a big tournament and you're playing the most important pot that you've played in months. You 3-bet with kings. The flop is 10-4 deuce, 2 hearts. You bet and get called. The turn is an offsuit king. You check. Your opponent bets and you check raise. What's going through your mind? It might be, please go all in. Please go all in. It might be, okay, if he calls, I really don't want to see the 9 of hearts. I don't want to see the queen of hearts. I don't even want to see an offsuit queen. I just want to be sure that I win this pot. I have the nuts right now. This is a huge pot. It's super important. Please let me win it. That line of thinking is hurting you. It's hurting you emotionally, and it's also getting in the way of you thinking as clearly as you can throughout the hand. That mental bandwidth could be used for thinking about strategy, how to play the hand better. Today, I want to talk about what I believe is the single most important mindset shift that you can make to improve your performance at the poker table. This line of thinking can come up when you're really hoping a card doesn't hit. It can come up when you're hoping your opponent folds, or you're hoping your opponent checks, or maybe you're hoping they raise, like I talked about. I'd categorize them as hope, fear, and regret. So hoping that your opponent raises, hoping your opponent checks back, fearing a certain turn card, fearing a certain river card, fearing a bet from your opponent. And then regret is always backwards looking, thinking about the call that you just made 5 hands ago that cost you a lot of chips, thinking about the call you just made in this hand on the previous street that you think you shouldn't have, or thinking about the fact that, you check back the turn with a good hand and now the river's brought a bunch of draws and you think, I just wish I made him fold the turn. I shouldn't have slow played. All of these thoughts wear on you. The 2 ways that this is impactful, first of all, emotionally. If you're thinking these things and feeling these things as you play a session, you're going to be more drained at the end of the day. You're going to be more emotional as you play, which is going to lead you to play worse. And you're really going to enjoy your experience playing less. You're going to enjoy your career or your hobby less because it's going to be emotionally painful in a lot of ways, stressful and painful. The second way that this causes problems is all of that energy and time that you're dedicating to hoping or fearing or regretting. You could be thinking about strategy. You could be thinking while your opponent's deciding whether he's going to, shove all in, fold or call when you check raise the tournament top set. Instead of hoping that he shoves, instead of fearing an unfortunate river, you could be thinking, okay, well, if he shoves, I know I call, I have the nuts. If he calls and the river is an offsuit 10, is it going to be better to jam or should I check and let him, bet all of his trips anyways and bluff his missed draws? You could be planning ahead and thinking about what you're going to do with your next action. Even if you're not planning ahead and thinking about each individual river card, what you're going to do, because there are so many, you could be thinking about making reads on your opponent. You could think, okay, well, what I know about him pre-flop means that his range is going to be kind of strong here. He's not the type to float flop with like queen jack and a backdoor flush draws, or so he's not going to have hands like that as much. I think his range is this. I think that once if he calls here, he's probably going to have whatever it is, 2 pair plus. I don't know. It's not going to be 2 pair plus, but he's probably going to be, really draw heavy. You could be thinking about putting your opponent on a hand, putting your opponent on a range. You could also be thinking about, what does my range look like? What does my opponent know about me? There's so many things that you could think during a poker hand that it's just impossible to consider them all in the time that we have while we're playing. It's even more impossible when you're spending half your time hoping or fearing or regretting something. So here is what I believe is the best way to conquer these emotions and fix your thought process so that you can perform at your very best at the poker table, so you have all that mental bandwidth. The way that I like to think about it is every time that the action is on me throughout a poker hand, I have an opportunity to make the best decision that I possibly can. I have an opportunity to make the right decision either against my opponent's range, or maybe I make a huge read to make the right decision against his actual hand, or I just make the right decision in theory, whichever is appropriate for the spot. Every time the action's on you, you have a new opportunity to make the best decision you possibly can. And if that's what you're focused on, it doesn't matter what card comes on the river, because it's just a new opportunity to make the best decision you possibly can. And in the long run, your results are going to be what they should be. But in the short term, anything can happen in a hand, and focusing so much on what you want to happen in this particular hand is so detrimental to you. Let's say I'm in a pot. I have a pretty good hand, but a lot of my opponent's range is going to be draws. Not all of it. They'll have some, weak mid pair, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get into the exact example because it doesn't matter. Instead of, once I bet the turn, I'm waiting for them to call, potentially. Instead of thinking, please don't bring the 9 of hearts on the river, whatever the case may be, I just think, okay, well, my next turn to act is either going to be if they raise now or if they call and one of these various rivers hit. If the draw completes, I actually know my hand's just a check fold. So actually, it's easy to make the best decision possible. I already know what to do. I just check fold. What should I do if the draw doesn't complete? Well, how often do I think they have mid pair versus how often they have the draw? Are they going to bluff that draw on check two, et cetera, et cetera? Then I start thinking about strategy, what I want to do there. And I find it so freeing to, instead of worrying about the draw completing and losing the hand, actually think, oh, well, actually the draw completing river is the easiest river to play. And so I'm going to be really successful on a draw completing river of finding the right play. Similarly, like if you're bluffing on the turn in a huge pot, instead of thinking, please fold, please fold, please fold, I get to think, okay, well, if they fold, the hand's over, no decision to make. If they raise, I have an easy decision, I fold. So let's stop hoping that they fold and start thinking about what we're going to do if they call on various rivers. If you can make this shift in your thought process, you can have such an easier time emotionally and an easier time thinking through your decisions on the fly. Focusing on really this one thing has helped me so much throughout my career, and I still need to remind myself of it. I don't do it every time. I still find myself being human, hoping for a certain thing to happen, fearing a certain thing happening, regretting a recent hand. But whenever I can remind myself of this, and I have, a sticky note of it, I calm my mind, I enjoy my sessions more, and I have my mental bandwidth working on what it should be working on. I hope you found that as helpful as I have found it in my career, and I will see you in the next video.
How many thoughts go through your mind during a poker hand? And how many of those thoughts are useful? I'm Phil Galfond. I've been playing poker professionally for literally half of my life. My producer, Thomas, who often does this, asked me to list a top 5 off the top of my head. Today's was top 5 things that I think about during a poker hand. We're gonna dive into hand reading. We're gonna talk about stack to pot ratio. Congrats on being here and taking your game seriously. Let's dive in.
All right, Phil, so this is top 5 questions you ask yourself every hand.
Ooh, I really like this one. Okay, so top 5 questions I ask myself. The simplest one is, what is my hand? I know that sounds silly, but evaluating the strength of your hand for the situation, your hand on this particular board, your hand in this particular spot after the action is played out a certain way, is a really important step in thinking through what you want to do next. Is my hand high up in my range? Is it low in my range? Is this hand one that I can get value with? Does this hand have good blocker qualities? Otherwise, meaning, does it interact in some way with the board or with my opponent's range such that I prevent my opponent from having as many of the good hands than he normally would if I didn't have these blockers? How good my hand is, how strong it is, how high it is in my range, and also how high it is, how strong it is compared to my opponent's range. But yeah, level 1 play, you have to be able to evaluate your hand strength for the situation. And that's just before we get into ranges, before we get into optimal play, you have to get a feel for how strong your hand is on a given board in a given line of action. What am I trying to accomplish with insert the next action that I want to take? It's so frequent that players will bet because they have top pair, or check because they have middle pair, or bet because they have a flush draw, or c-bet because they raise pre-flop. And those are not reasons. They are reasons, and if they're your reasons, it's good that you become aware of them and state them either out loud or in an internal monologue. But those are not good reasons. Good reasons to bet or check or call or fold or whatever you may be doing. For example, you could bet to get value, also known as making a worse hand put money in. You could bluff, also known as getting a better hand to fold, or getting a hand with good equity to fold when it had proper odds to call. You could be in a situation where, because of the makeup of your range, you're just supposed to bet everything if you're playing theoretically correct. And then there are other, smaller reasons to bet. Maybe you want some protection with your hand, which I caution you against using too much. Maybe you want to make the hand harder to play for your opponent, which is often a bad reason. Making the hand easier to play for you and harder for your opponent is a reason that people come up with that is not good. However, that often coincides with disguising your hand, keeping your range uncapped, making your opponent define their hand more. And those are actually kind of good reasons. So you're sort of onto something if you're thinking along those lines. But far and away, the most important takeaway here is have a reason for your action. Don't just mindlessly bet. Next up, I think about my range. What is my overall range? By that, real quick, for those who aren't familiar with ranges, I mean, what are all of the hands that I would play up until this point in the hand the same way? Because those are all of the hands that I could have here that my opponent needs to worry about. And not only does my opponent need to worry about, I need to worry about it, because if I'm getting advanced for a second, there's such thing as minimum defense frequency. So in a lot of spots, you want to make sure that you're not exploitable by folding to a bet
90% of the time or folding to a bet 70% of the time. You want to make sure that you're not betting the river 90% of the time in a given spot. There are some rare exceptions where these things are okay, but for the most part, you want to make your opponent indifferent to bluffing or to calling or folding. And what that means is if I'm in a given spot and I know, okay, well, very roughly, by the way, you don't need to know your exact range. Don't worry about that. But I know very roughly I have like high pairs, I have broadways, I have suited connectors. And on this board, when I flop middle pair with 9-8 suited on, let's say, Queen 8-4, I'm kind of middle of my range or so. So if my opponent is betting a relatively large sizing and there's nothing particularly interesting about my opponent's range that would make me have to worry about that, kind of at the midpoint between whether it's a fold or a call. This is a very, very super simplification. But knowing your range can not only help you make sure you're not exploitable, but a lot of people find comfort in facing a big bet and not knowing what to do and then just reverting to, okay, well, I know that this is one of the top 10% of hands that I could have here. So if I don't have a read on my opponent, I just need to put in the call with a hand this good and I don't need to worry about it. And similarly, if you're facing a huge bet on the river, you think, well, maybe he's bluffing, maybe he's not, but I don't have a good guess. And this hand is in the bottom 30% roughly of the hands that I have here. So I'm just gonna fold and I'm not exploitable. Next up is your opponent's range. And if you have multiple opponents, their ranges. Similar to the way that you think about your range and all the hands you can have, hand reading is extremely important. So what is the range that my opponent would play up until this point in the same way that they've played this hand? This is where you can go from kind of basic hand reading to really advanced stuff, where if you have a good idea of your opponent's range and you know, for example, this opponent's really likely to fold if he doesn't have middle pair or better. And based on the range he's played this way, he's gonna have middle pair or better only like 25% of the time. So I can bluff with everything. So it's a way to find exploits as well as a way to figure out rough optimal play frequencies. And similarly, if your opponent has played a hand in a certain way and is betting river, and you can think to yourself, well, how many value hands does my opponent have in their range? Well, they have a lot of top pair, they have a lot of two pair, they river some straights with their semi bluffs. And then how many bluffs do they have? Well, they have a couple of missed flush draw combos, but they like to give up with those. And otherwise they just have too much showdown value with this range to bluff. So probably they're not bluffing enough and I should just fold everything. So knowing your opponent's range is the first step in finding great exploits. I'm gonna kind of cheat for this last one because there are two that I really want to fit in. So I'll just mention one that would technically be the sixth, but I don't need to go into too much detail because it's kind of simple. You need to know your stack size and the pot size. There you go. So the one that's going to be the official fifth, what is the board texture and whose range does it favor? So this is getting more advanced. You know your hand, you know your range, you know your opponent's range. Now you have to think about, okay, well, how do these ranges interact on this board? And if you're getting very advanced, based on that range interaction, first of all, who has the range advantage, which is not that advanced just yet. But second of all, what does that mean about optimal play? And you could even think of things like, where is that range advantage? So for example, on a board of Queen 10-4, if we have relatively short stacks, if I'm the three better, I have more over pairs. I have a little bit more ace queen, king queen. I have more sets because they would have shoved pre-flop with queen queen and 10-10. I just have a lot, and I have more Broadway straight draw. So I have a lot of good stuff there. And so my range has a big advantage. Obviously, barring a lot of things, I'm being overly general. So in that spot, I want to have a high betting frequency. And also in that spot, if I bet my opponent raises and I have a marginal hand, I don't need to worry about being run over because I know that my range can support me really well on that board. But understanding the board texture and how it interacts with ranges helps dictate what optimal play should look like. So there are a lot of spots, which I've kind of hinted at earlier, where one player is just supposed to bet their full range or close to it. And there are a lot of spots where one player is supposed to check their whole range or close to it. For those spots, it's often dictated by who has the range advantage. If you have a big range advantage, those are the situations where you might want to do a lot of betting. If your opponent has a big range advantage, those are the situations where you might want to do a lot of checking. To get more nuanced, you want to think about what kind of tier of hands you or your opponent has the advantage in. Sometimes player B has the nut advantage, meaning having more nutted hands. However, that's still just a small fraction of their range. And player A has the second tier advantage, the strong but not nutted hand advantage. Basically, this is figuring out gaps in certain people's ranges based on the way that they played the hand and based on the board texture. And this is where you find spots where, you know, if you don't have a nut advantage, but you have a big second tier advantage, this is a spot where you might want to use a small sizing a lot. Again, very hard to make some all-encompassing statements about these things in a short video, but these are the things you want to think about.
Would you want to just expand on the bonus point?
Okay. Yeah, I could do the 6th. Bonus round, 6th thing that I think about during a hand, and I'm doing a bonus, so you have to subscribe, by the way. Pot size and stack size and how they relate to each other, otherwise known as stack to pot ratio. There are a lot of situations where top pair is a really good hand, and then there are other situations where it's not a very good hand. And yes, this has to do with the board, but it also has to do with how much money is behind and how much money is going in. So in spots where there's not much stack behind by the time you get to the flop and ranges aren't super narrowly defined, top pair's a really good hand. And in spots where stacks are deeper, you don't necessarily want to be forcing in a lot of money with top pair with like flop check raises or with flop C bets and turn C bets and river C bets, because by the time you get called down across 3 streets, you're not often going to be good anymore. The reason this happens, I think this is intuitive to a lot of people, but ask yourself, do you really understand theoretically why this is? And hopefully the theoretical understanding will help you. So the theoretical reason this is because if I pot the flop and pot the turn and pot the river, this is just to make the math simple. On the flop, my opponent has to call roughly half their range. On the turn, they have to call again with roughly half their range. Now we're at 25% of their starting range. And on the river, they have to call with roughly half of that range. So now they're at 12.5% of their starting range. So if you're putting in 3 pot size bets, this isn't any raises, by the way, they're calling now 12.5% of their starting range. And so you need a stronger hand to beat 12.5% of their starting range more than half the time, which is the rough threshold for a value bet. It's a little bit different. So in a scenario where you have 1 pot size bet left, especially when you're going to be jamming a lot of things that have equity, they have to call more than half their range. So now you only have to beat 60% of their range. And there are also other considerations, like if you check, you can't fold anyways because you have equity, so you might as well get the fold equity, et cetera, et cetera. And then in spots where, you know, you can half pot flop and half pot turn, and the half pot turn is all in. Why do I make myself do math in videos? Well, now when you're half potting flop, they have to defend 2/3 of the time. And then by the turn, they have to defend another roughly 2/3 of the time. So that is 4/9 of their range. So 40-some% of their range. So 40-some% of the range is what you have to beat compared to the 12.5%. Remember, if we're potting 3 streets. So this is why stack to pot ratio makes such a big difference for the threshold of what's good enough to try to force stacks in, try to put a lot of money in with. And oftentimes when you're deep and you have a hand that's not good enough to bet 3 streets, unless ranges dictate that you bet early, it's often better to wait until a later street to bet. So start checking early, induce some bluffs, and then get your value later. The other really important thing about stack to pot ratio is, especially on a board that's relatively static, where your opponent's not going to have a lot of big draws, with the deeper stacks, especially if you have a nut advantage, you want to be betting pretty big across multiple streets. But with shallow stacks, you don't need to bet big to get all the money in by the river. And so if the board is static, you usually want to spread that bet out across, spread your bets out across 3 streets at a similar ratio. This is called geometric bet sizing, which is roughly defined, or I think literally defined as betting on each street the same percentage of the pot as you did on the previous street. So this requires a lot of math to get perfect, but you can get kind of close if you figure, well, if I bet this much on the flop, and that'll leave me this stack to pot ratio on the turn, which I can kind of bet the same amount, and it'll kind of get close on the river as well. Now, there are some spots where you want to go for 2 streets rather than 3 streets all in, and the 2 street spots are more often ones where there are more draws to be had, and you want to avoid giving your opponent the opportunity to river 2 pair. Like, just force the money in now and make them call before the river value bet gets kind of thin.
I also have questions I ask myself both during and after hands and during and in between sessions. Should I keep playing? Am I in the right state of mind? Is this a good quality game for me to play in, given how long I've been playing, how long I've been awake? These things are really important to not only ask yourself during the session, but to prepare to ask yourself, sometimes with a script, before your sessions away from the table. I detail this and many other mindset tips in Poker Mindset Strategy, my free mindset ebook, which you can get if you click the link in the pinned comment below. Now back to the tips.
Hey everybody, Phil here. We are going with the classic format today. My producer Thomas is going to throw me a suggestion of a top 5 on the fly. I'm going to come up with the best answers that I can, and I hope you find them helpful. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, top 5 tournament struggles and how to fix them. This is a good one, but a tough one for me. So when somebody says, I can usually survive a long time in a tournament, but I'm never making final tables, I'm never building a huge chip stack, or if I do build a huge chip stack, it just kind of dwindles. What am I doing wrong? The long run in tournaments takes a very long time. So you have to keep in mind that even if you are experiencing these types of results, you don't put too much weight into this, because you might be doing everything right. I mean, nobody's doing everything right, but you might be. This might not be you, but if this statement resonates with you, if it rings true for your experience, usually what causes that over the long term is that you are playing too tight, specifically not gambling enough in the later stages of the tournament. So much about bubble play and short stack play in general is about aggression and putting all of your chips in, especially being the one to go all in, but sometimes calling it off with hands that you are kind of afraid to call it off with. That's where a lot of the money is won. And you have to keep in mind that, everything that you feel emotionally in a tournament. So let's say you're on the bubble and you just really want to make the money, and you're afraid that if you go all in, you're going to get called and you're going to bust out. You're afraid that someone's shoving a range that, you might be ahead of, but you can't really call it off because then, the bubble is looming, and maybe you're not ahead of the range, but maybe if you're ahead of their hand, they'll still suck out. All of those things that you're feeling, other people are feeling as well. Everybody's human so far. The way to capitalize on that fear, those emotions, are to be the one putting people in uncomfortable spots. You should be the one attacking blinds. You should be the one 3-bet jamming against somebody who's opening too wide. And I think a lot of this can be solved by looking at charts of how you should play with 8 big blinds, 10 big blinds, 15 big blinds, 20 big blinds. Sometimes it will surprise you how much you should be sticking your money in, both as the caller and as the raiser. Poker is a very different game when played at 15 big blinds than at 100 big blinds. You can't kind of wait for the same stranglehold on a hand to put your money in with. You need to just get your money in and hope for the best. And oftentimes when you have 10 big blinds, stealing the 2.5 big blinds in the pot with the big blind and the small blind and the ante, that's 25% increase to your stack. And the most you can lose of your stack is 100%. So if you're making that 25% increase and then somebody calls, you're always going to have equity when they call. Minimum 20%, often 40%, 50%. And so then you're, even with that 2.5 big blind overlay, you might be making money with your 45% equity. If you fall into this category, look at some of the ways that you should play in theory. Push yourself to play more aggressively, probably even more aggressively than you should in theory. A problem that I sometimes see, somebody will say, I seem to always get off to a good start, but by the end of day 1 or into day 2, I never make something happen, or I find myself in so many tough spots, or I get confused often. This could be a couple of things, but one thing I want to draw your attention to is energy management. So tournaments, especially live tournaments, are grueling. A 12, 14-hour day, you'll sleep for 6 hours, then you'll play another 12, 14-hour day. It's so important to manage your energy levels and your expectations for yourself. You're not going to be at your best 12 hours in, neither are your opponents. There are things you can do to improve your focus levels and energy levels. I would say, avoid over caffeinating early, especially because early in a tournament, blinds are so small compared to what they are later in the tournament. You're actually playing for much smaller stakes than you will be later. So by over caffeinating at the beginning of the day, you're gonna have that crash in the later half of the day when you're playing higher stakes. And you can either recaffeinate and hope for the best and then probably disturb your sleep, or you can not and you can just be crashed. Similarly, day 2s, day 3s, and you're feeling unfocused and you're really beaten down. First of all, it's kind of normal, but second of all, you need to be prioritizing sleep. There's no substitute for sleep and what it does for you. Anything that you can do in order to, when the tournament day is done, wind down, get back to wherever you can sleep faster. There's a lot of value in staying closer to the venue because of that time saved in the commute, getting you back and getting you into your evening routine and winding down. And that's another aspect. Winding down from the session is really important. When you're playing all day, you have so much, your mind is racing, you have so much adrenaline every time you enter kind of a big pot that you'll leave, you'll be amped up, and you'll continue to have thoughts, if you're anything like me, replaying through your mind. Elliot Rowe has some MP3s for post-session kind of meditations, but general meditation of any kind, taking a walk while listening to some music, anything that would help you unwind. Going right from that to, all right, I'm going to sleep now, or all right, I'm going to go hang out with my family for a little bit and then go to sleep. Having something in between to kind of turn your brain off, kind of start the relaxation process is really helpful. So another problem people have is not being aware enough of the structure and what that means for your game and your time management. You start with a certain number of big blinds, the blinds increase at this rate. You can kind of have a rough idea of when the bubble might burst. This is relevant in a few ways. First of all, some levels, the antes are a bigger portion of the blinds, and some they're smaller. And I actually like to vary my play. So when the antes are a smaller portion of the big blind, I will play extra tight, even more than the antes kind of dictate, because I want to build an image for the next level where antes are going to be big and I'm going to be playing a lot more aggressively trying to steal those antes. But anyways, just being aware of the structure from a strategic perspective is helpful. Now also, if you have a tournament that's starting, 200 big blinds deep, 4 hours in is 75 big blinds deep, it's a great opportunity if they have late registration to just wait and register late. This is debatable, certainly, and if you have a big edge and people are in there early punting off their stacks, then okay. But if you're playing a grueling schedule day in, day out, like at the World Series of Poker, getting that extra 2 hours of sleep, getting that rest even of some kind that's not sleep is really powerful. Is going to add up over time, or rather the opposite effects, the lack of sleep is going to compound over time. And if you're playing for a month straight or a month and a half, like the World Series of Poker, managing your sleep and energy in the early days by skipping some levels that are, relatively unimportant, I think is really valuable. I see a lot of players struggle with mentally resetting and adapting to new circumstances. So what I mean by that is sometimes you're playing at a table, you're, kind of deep in the tournament, and you're the chip leader at the table. So you have your foot on the gas, you're running people over, and then you lose a big pot. And now all of a sudden you're, average stack at the table. A lot of people, first of all, they just have been playing that way for a little while. So the routine kind of just continues. They keep opening the same number of hands as they were before when they shouldn't be. And then other people are just thinking about getting back to that stack because they want to be back to the stack that they were. There's so much of that in poker tournaments, getting back to your peak stack. And that's really detrimental to your thought process. Resetting and moving on to the new conditions that you find yourself in is really valuable, because putting out of your mind where you were, looking at where you are now, the makeup of your table, and then what strategy should look like with your new stack, and this player now having a big stack on your left and this player on your right being relatively tight, all those things, they change when your stack size change, and your stack size can change in an individual hand in a matter of seconds. So be ready and willing to adapt. Similarly, even if your stack stays the same, somebody else's stack might double and they now cover you, and they're a really loose aggressive player, and that should totally change the way that you play from there on out. Or somebody gets moved away from your table, somebody gets moved to your table, you now have a completely different dynamic to keep in mind. Tournaments are really, really dynamic in the way that you need to adjust to the number of big blinds that everybody else at the table has, the payout structure as you get closer to the money, or you're in the money and closer to the final table. There are so many elements that you need to keep in mind. And so being ready at all times to make those adjustments, to consciously think about those adjustments, not just be like, oh, I know it's getting closer to the money, so I should be a little tighter. Just think through, okay, where are we at right now? What does that mean for me? What is my strategy going to be for this period of the tournament? And then if 2 hands later you lose a big pot, do it again. all right, we're still at this point in the tournament, but now my stack is this. What should my strategy be now for this point in the tournament? Not commonly occurring problem, but an expensive problem that people have in tournaments is when they get to a final table and it starts to get down to 5-handed, 4-handed, 3-handed, heads up, they get run over. Because the majority, if you play tournaments every day, the majority of the time you're going to be playing at a full table. You know, at all points up until the final table, you play at a full table. That's the overwhelming majority of a tournament. And then even once you get to the final table, it starts as a full table. But playing shorthanded is a bit different. Honestly, playing shorthanded does not require a different skill set. It's just that a skill set that is too weak is going to get exposed in a shorthanded lineup. Let's say everybody folds to you on the button. You're playing 3-handed now. You're on the button, there's just a small blind and the big blind, and you're playing 3-handed. Everybody else is out of the pot. So strategy there on the button is really similar to strategy playing 3-handed on the button. The problem is some people who are too tight, too passive, when they're at a full table, they can capitalize on other players' looseness and win more pots than they should against weaker hands. But then they don't play well when it's folded to them on the button. They don't play well when it's folded to them in the cutoff. They don't play well when the button opens and they're in the big blind. But that gets made up for by the other pots that they play, and generally, of course, with lower blind levels and deeper stacks. At a 4-handed table, if you're too tight and passive, it's going to be exposed. And certainly when you're heads up, it's going to be exposed. So work on your short-handed play, I would say, by getting practice maybe in cash games, getting practice in sit and goes. Sit and goes are a great way to start to basically simulate a final table. If you start a 6-handed sit and go or a 9-handed sit and go, if they even have those anymore, and just go from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, and stacks just like in tournaments, blinds just like in tournaments. That will help you really improve your final table play. And what you may not realize is that by improving your final table play, improving your 3-handed and 4-handed play, you're actually improving your full ring play, because you're improving the way that you play from the cutoff, from the button, against the cutoff and the button, against the small blind from the big blind. That's an area that I think a lot of people assume only helps them once they make the final table, which is important, but it doesn't happen that often. But no, it helps you throughout the whole tournament. So work on your shorthanded play, and it will just strengthen your poker game all around. Whether you're going to play the World Series of Poker or any other tournament, remember, at the end of the day, tournaments are supposed to be fun. Poker's supposed to be fun, but especially tournaments. They're a really fun and exciting format. They also can bring with them a lot of emotions, just like any poker, but tournaments especially, the stakes are literally raised as you go through the tournament. They can be more stressful than cash games. They can be more tense and intense than cash games. And so by going into it, having no real expectations, you know that your goal is to play the best you can, and your goal is to have fun. And if you're attempting to just do those two things, and you know that the results will be what the results will be, because in any individual tournament, they're out of your hands, you'll set yourself up for more success, not only emotionally and personally, but financially as well. I think you'll have better results if you go in with those expectations.
All right, Phil, it's another top 5. If you've never heard this before, let's see what you can make out of it. Top 5 times to bail on a bluff.
All right, top 5 times you should bail on a bluff. It's a good one, Thomas. So number 1, a lot of draws have missed. This is kind of a spot where, on average, people are expecting you to bluff. So you check call flop on Queen 9-6 with 2 spades, and the turn is a deuce. It goes offsuit deuce. It goes check check. River's an offsuit 3, and you bet, or you're considering betting. This is a spot where Jack 10 has missed, 10-8 has missed, 7-8 has missed, King 10 has missed, flush draws have missed. I could have listed more straight draws. There are more out there. You can figure them out. So many draws have missed that, if you bluff with all of them, you're going to have too many bluffs. And actually, what ends up happening usually is that people, because of that, people overcall the river in that spot. And so the actual thing you should do is not bluff with any of them, more or less, unless you have reason to believe that your opponent's going to fold appropriately, or that they're going to adjust to you never bluffing that spot. So first reason, too many draws missed. Second reason to bail on a bluff is you're up against somebody who likes to call. This is it's almost a topic for a whole video, but I'll just sum it up quickly. It's important to, like when profiling players, figure out what people love to do, like to do, hate to do, are afraid to do. And you'll find some players who are afraid to make calls and lose. You'll find some players who love to make calls and who are afraid to fold the best hand. So there are some people who just call way too much. And from playing with them for not that long, you can often tell by clues such as the speed at which they call rivers, which kind of indicates the difficulty in their mind of the decision, or how much they thought about not calling, and then the hands that they show down. So some people just call way too much. And, if you're up against somebody who's going to call 75% of the time when you bet big on the river, you just can't bluff. I don't care what theory says, what a solver says, you're going to lose money bluffing. So just don't do it. Unless you're playing with this person for a long enough time and you think they're actually going to notice that you've given up on enough bluffs and they're going to actually start folding, then occasionally bluff. But yeah, just don't do it. Number 3, you are losing a lot of money at the time and or have shown down a lot of bluffs. So this is 2, but I'm going to put them together because basically number 3 is people are going to perceive you to be bluffy. In live poker, like some people when they're losing, they adjust by tightening up and they actually don't bluff as much. They just wait for like good hands because they don't want to lose more. But on average, people who are losing tend to get looser. They tend to get splashier. They try to win more pots and make something happen. They try to recapture a win or get even, because that's how most players act. That's what most people assume that you're doing. So in a spot where you've been losing a lot, you just have to give up on a few more bluffs, I think, because on average, people are going to assume that you're bluffing more once you're down. And the same thing is true. You've been at a table for a while. You've made 2 big river bets over the last hour. They were both bluffs. I mean, the way people kind of should adjust is actually probably to not call you next time, because most people make the right adjustment and underbluff. But actually the way people do adjust is they just are like, well, this guy bluffs a lot, so I'm going to call again. So number 3, if you seem like you're in the mood to bluff, or you have the image that you're very bluffy, bail. I guess along the same lines, number 4 is you're up against somebody who's losing a lot of money or clearly frustrated. Actually, I'm going to generalize a little bit more. You're up against somebody who is showing a disregard for the money that they're putting into the pot. So this could be because they're just super rich and they don't really care, and you see them just splashing a bunch of chips into the pot all the time quickly. It could be because they've been losing a lot of money and right now they're just tilted out of their mind and they just want to put money in. They just want to try to win a pot. It could be for a number of reasons, but basically you've identified that your opponent is more than happy to put money in. It's not a good time to bluff them. And lastly, number 5 is when you don't represent anything. So it's challenging to come up with a specific example of a time when you don't represent anything. But essentially, there are some spots in poker that come up where you're not supposed to have a raising range, or you're not supposed to have a betting range, or, the entire range that you were playing for value because of the turn or river that hit can no longer value bet. Like there are spots that come up where, you're representing a set and then a straight and a flush come on the turn. And yes, you can have those straights and flushes, but the way that you're supposed to play is actually to check everything, including your straights and flushes, because you need to protect the part of your range that are sets that have now been devalued. So there are times like that. There are a lot of times in poker where, in theory, you're just not supposed to bet anything, or you're not supposed to raise anything because of the makeup of your range. And similarly, like there are some very obscure spots that come up where like a lot of money's gone into the pot and you're very specifically repping like one hand or 2 hands. And then the board changes in such a way that those 1 or 2 hands wouldn't bet anymore. Now you need to stop betting because you're not representing anything. Obviously, it's very general advice, and be aware of the spots situationally and adjust to them in the moment. Sometimes you can't represent the hands you were representing, but you actually can represent the draws that have gotten there. Then you can go for it. But yeah, be aware of the spots where you're not representing anything, because people who hand read are going to know, and they're going to call you down. With all of that, before I go, I want to tell you that through the years of my career, and people I've talked poker with, coached, 95% of of these people don't bluff enough. And they look for these reasons, these 5 reasons to bail on a bluff, and they look for others. So please use caution in finding reasons to bail on your bluff, because more often than not, like if you're the average person bails on bluffs too frequently. And I think the key there is to be aware, like I talked about in I forget which number, but people who like to overcall, be aware of what at the poker table makes you uncomfortable, what scares you. If it's making a big bluff or making a big semi-bluff or whatever the case may be, know that about yourself. Know that that makes you uncomfortable. You don't need to fix yourself. If you can make it so that it doesn't make you uncomfortable anymore, that's amazing. Most people can't do that. You don't need to do that necessarily. But what you need to do is know your bias and know that when you're in a river spot and you're thinking, should I bluff here or not? Oh, you know what? It seems like he's going to call me a lot here, so I just shouldn't. Know that emotionally that's the decision you want to make, and your bias is going to lead you to come up with reasons to bail on that bluff. So really challenge yourself, really ask yourself if the reason's legit, and probably more often than not, unless you have a really good reason to, just push yourself to make a few more of the bluffs that you don't really want to. And I think it's going to make your game stronger. So hopefully you found that helpful. Just gave you 5 reasons to bail on a bluff and told you to ignore them. Good luck at the tables, and I'll see you in the next video.
Read it to you. We'll see if you can make it into something good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Top 5 river mistakes.
All right. Top 5 river mistakes. This is a good one. I like, river's the most important street. Actually, a lot of people disagree and say pre-flop's the most important. But as long as you're okay at pre-flop, I think river's the most important street in poker. So let's go through top 5 river mistakes. Number 1, which is bluffing because you can't win if you check. In order for a bluff to be good, the simplest definition is your opponent needs to fold often enough so that your bet is profitable. That's the simplest way to look at it. So looking at it in a vacuum, decide if your opponent's folding enough and then decide if the bet is good. If your opponent's not folding enough, it doesn't matter that you can't win if you check, because you can only lose more if you bet on average. The other thing now, if we're getting higher level and you're thinking about the way that proper strategy comes together, an optimal play, well, it really depends how often you have a hand that can't win versus how often you have a hand that is good enough to value bet. Because sometimes the hand plays out in such a way that you have a lot of missed draws, you have a lot of air. And if you bluff with all of it, you're going to be way over bluffing because you don't have as many value bets to balance that out. I think a really good example of that is something that you would only see from an amateur player, which is, let's say, button opens, we call in the big blind with 10-8 of spades, and the flop is 9-7-4 rainbow. We check call. The turn is an offsuit king. We check call. The river is a king, and now we lead. So you're not supposed to lead anything there because the button's value range can all still value bet. So if you have a full house, you want to just check and let your opponent bet. Even if you have trip kings and maybe you can't quite check raise, it's still just a check call. So you just don't have any leads there. So if you start bluffing hands because you can't win if you check, then you're over bluffing because you're only betting bluffs. You're not betting any value bets. So that's kind of the obvious example, but there are a ton of examples like that. Maybe not where you have no value bets, but where you're bluffing candidates far outnumber your value bets. You can't bet all of them. So number 1, bluffing because you can't win. Number 2 is calling because you have a pretty good hand. This is probably the most common river mistake, which is, you get to the river, you have a pretty good hand, but your opponent's representing a better hand, and you call because your hand's pretty good. What you should actually do is decide whether to call or fold based on what your opponent's value range is, what your opponent's bluffing range is, what the ratio of bluffs to value actually is in your estimation compared to the pot odds that you're getting. And then you factor in your blocker effects. So sometimes it is the case that you should call with more pretty good hands because a pretty good hand like top pair blocks your opponent from having a lot of value bets, like a better top pair or top and bottom pair, whatever the case may be. But the fact that you have a pretty good hand is not at all a reason to call. There are a lot of situations where,
because of factors I talked about in point one, people are going to overbluff or underbluff. And if you can identify spots where they're underbluffing and you can fold your pretty good hand, this is how you make money in poker. If you can identify spots where they're overbluffing, you can call with your pretty good hand. You can call with your pretty bad hand too. And this is also how you make money in poker. So don't just look at the board and look at your hand. You shrug your shoulders and flick in the call. I guess point three, which is kind of cheating, don't look at a pretty bad hand and fold because your hand's pretty bad. The exact same thing I just said in point two, but sometimes it's a spot where it's a great calling spot because people are over bluffing. And it doesn't matter if your hand is pretty good or pretty bad, as long as it beats their bluffs and they're bluffing enough. So that's kind of the quick point three. So number four is betting because you think you have the best hand. Another common one. So I had this happen once where I was playing. This was very early in my career, and I was like exclusively an online player, and I played pretty high stakes online, like 5,100 at this point, no limit. I sat down. I remember I was at the Win in a 25-50 no limit game, and for a long time I was playing, and it seemed like everybody kind of knew what they were doing. Like they talked about poker with poker lingo, and it seemed like they were playing reasonably tight. And I don't know, until I got in this spot where, let's just say it was like Queen 8-5. I check called 7, bringing 2 hearts. I check called river, jack of hearts, and I checked, and my opponent bet. I ended up calling with a bluff catcher because I thought it doesn't matter. Once I call, my opponent turns over king queen. He's like, I guess this is no good. And I didn't snap call. Like, I didn't beat him into the pot. I just took a while and then called. And he's like, I guess you got this beat. And that's when I realized he didn't actually know what he was doing in poker. Because if you have a good hand and you bet, but when they call, you expect to lose, why did you bet? What was the point of betting? Are you trying to value bet or are you trying to bluff? He was trying to do neither. He just thought, I think my queen's probably good, so I'll bet. There are a lot of times in poker where it's extremely likely that your hand is best on the river, but your opponent has so many hands that are just missed draws that need to fold. Or the hand is just played out in such a way that they don't need to call many worse hands. You may have the best hand 80% of the time, you may have the best hand 90% of the time, you may have the best hand 60% of the time. And especially if it's on that lower end of the range, that's not enough reason to bet. You need to be ahead of the range that calls you. And you need to have more expected value betting than checking, which is a kind of more nuanced conversation about the expected value of check calling or the expected value of checking back, because when you bet, yes, you can get called by worse hands, but you can also get check raised by worse hands and better hands, etc. Your thought process needs to go beyond, I think I have the best hand, so I bet. And that actually, by the way, that carries through to every street. There's so much, okay, I bet flop because I have a pair. Okay, you know what? I think he probably doesn't have me beat. I'm going to bet turn again. But why? When it's like not a clear value bet, not a 3-street value bet. Anyways, so let's find number 5. All right, let's see. Another river mistake is playing your hand in the exact way that your hand wants to play. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say we find ourselves in a river spot where most of our value bets are flushes, but we happen to have a good top pair that we think if we bet small, it is good enough to get value with. This is an oversimplification of the spot, but I don't want to take 10 minutes to lay out a spot. But let's say, the way the hand's played out, we mostly have flushes or bluffs, but actually we found ourselves in this spot for some reason or another with top pair, top kicker. And we can't, we can bet 1.5 times pot with our flushes and our bluffs. But with top pair, top kicker, if we bet 1.5 times pot, it's too thin. We can't do that. But we think we can third pot, top pair, top kicker, and still be ahead of a calling range. A lot of times, it's not worth going for that bet with the small, tiny portion of your range that can do it, because your opponent can read into it. Sometimes it's much better to just stick with your overall strategy of, because of the way I played this hand, my only bet size on this river is 1.5 times pot. And even if this hand is good enough for a smaller bet, it's not good enough for my only bet size in this situation. So I'm just going to check. It's important to understand your range construction and the strategy that you're using, and not just custom bet size for every hand that you might have. Now, against weaker opponents, kind of doesn't matter. You can do what you want. They're not going to read into it too much. But what happens against good opponents, is when they can recognize that the only hand that you would bet for that sizing for value is like a top pair hand. They can value raise perfectly and they can bluff raise a lot. So don't let them make that read. Go ahead and check and let them, potentially like check back like a weak 2 pair, depending on how the hand's played out, or potentially check back a weaker 1 pair that might have bluff raised had you bet small. Just kind of know your range, know what your range wants to do as a whole. And sometimes you have to sacrifice what a couple of individual hands want to do for the betterment of your overall strategy, and actually even for the EV of those specific hands if you're up against a tough opponent.
Hey everybody, Phil here. Today I'm going to talk about 10 ways to make your poker career unsuccessful. These are all things that I think will hold you back in one way or another. I'm going to talk about why that is for each of them. Then at the end, I'm going to talk about two of these that actually I've struggled with the most, and mistakes that I've made in my career. So without further ado, let's get to the list. First way to make your poker career unsuccessful is to get into poker for the money. I've known so many people that, especially during the height of the poker boom in the early 2000s, just knew somebody who was making a lot of money playing poker, and they said, oh, I'll give it a try too. And actually you could at first, and even now today, without that kind of passion or love of the game, you can start to do well. But poker is such a challenging career, especially emotionally. You need so much resilience in the face of extended downswings, games drying up, and having to potentially completely shift gears and kind of change your career path. People who got into it because they saw it as an easy way to make money, who didn't really love the game, almost all of them, or basically every single one I can think of, burnt out and didn't make it. Number 2, build the foundation of your game by memorizing strategies. Especially today in 2022 and soon to be 2023, solvers can tell you how to play any given spot. And these are extremely powerful tools, and they've advanced the game a huge amount. But the way to learn from them is not simply to memorize strategies. If you're playing hyper turbo sit and goes where you're mostly like 10 big blind stack, then sure, just try to memorize push fold ranges, pre-flop, and open ranges, because there's not much play after then. But there are so many ways in which a hand can play out, and so many ways in which a board can run out, that it's impossible for any human that I've ever met to memorize enough of a strategy to execute it competently. What'll happen is, if you're just trying to memorize a solver strategy, you're going to play very well pre-flop, you're going to play reasonably well on the flop, and then it's all going to fall apart on the turn and river. When you're studying with these tools, you have to try to figure out what the solver is thinking, and thinking should be in air quotes, actually, because it doesn't think. The solver, the way that it learns how to play, is actually brute forces and figures out what's the highest EV strategy. It doesn't really understand why. It doesn't understand pot odds. But you have to kind of apply a human thought process to the outputs that you're seeing, because that way you can reference that thought process in game, and it can kind of shape your human thought process, which has the ability to adapt to a number of situations without memorization. Whereas, if you were to plug in a bot based on solver outputs, it can handle every situation because it's actually memorized how to play every situation. It solved them, and then it references that, but it doesn't think through hands in the same way that a human can. In other words, you're a human, I think. Try to learn and play like a human. Don't try to learn and play like a bot. Number 3, base your confidence on recent results. This is a common one we all probably have suffered from at some point in our career a little bit. It's very easy to fall into the trap of, oh, I've won several sessions in a row. I'm a god. I'm playing great. I have a huge edge in this game. And then on the flip side, you lose for a month straight, and you're like, I don't think I can win anymore. I need to start changing up my strategy. I need to try a whole bunch of new things. Essentially, don't be results oriented. We all know as poker players that a huge part of our day-to-day results are going to be based on variance, on luck. Yes, over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, kind of skill is going to overpower the luck. The long run, we'll get there, and your true results or your true expected value will start to show. Your results will regress to the mean, in other words. But in the short term, it's just going to be all over the place. That's how it is. And if you let that affect you too much, it's going to throw you off track all the time. Number 4, only learn by yourself. The fastest way to learn in poker, and probably in almost anything, is to collaborate with other people. I remember my first summer in Las Vegas. So I had played semi-professionally online for probably 2 years. I was participating in forums and learning that way. I was reading books. When I came to Vegas during the summer, I stayed in a house with 5 other guys. It was the first time I'd ever watched somebody play poker. And when you watch somebody else play, or you even see hands from other people, you get to say, oh, why did you do that? Like, I never even thought to make a play like that. Not only being able to kind of be exposed to different ways to play, different lines of thinking, but then having that feedback to work together, it just accelerates growth so much. However you can get into a study group or make poker friends, I highly encourage you to do it. Or if you want to be unsuccessful, I highly encourage you not to. Number 5, know that if you won the pot, you played it right. This is another version of being results oriented, but essentially so many players will review hands that they've lost after a session. They'll look at them with a critical eye because really it's an emotional thing. You think, oh, I lost this hand. I lost a lot of money this hand. I feel bad about it. I want to go check to see if I played it right. And if I feel like I played it right based on a solver or based on something else, then I'll feel better about it. But when you won a hand, you don't need that kind of emotional Band-Aid. So you just kind of let it go and you think, well, I won the hand. So you can learn a lot from the hands that you won, as well as the hands you lost. You can make a lot of mistakes in hands that you've won. And so ignoring them is really ignoring, half of your data. 6th way to make sure your poker career is unsuccessful: quit early when you're winning. And when you're losing, play as long as you can to try to get unstuck. This is one that most people suffer from. I actually personally never had the issue of wanting to quit to book a win. I like to play a really long time, win or lose. In simple terms, when you're winning, your mood is better. You're experiencing less fear and nervousness while you're playing, and essentially you're going to play better when you're winning. When you're losing, you're going to have some kind of tilt, whether it's a desire to gamble more to get unstuck, a fear of making a big bluff and losing another buy-in, a number of things like that. So by playing longer sessions when you're losing, you're actually putting in more hands on your C and D game and fewer hands. By quitting when you're winning, you're putting in fewer hands when you're on your A game. So do the opposite of that. And because you're not going to want to emotionally, it's important to kind of set stop losses ahead of time that you kind of promise yourself you're going to stick to. That way you don't have to make that decision in game when your mental state is compromised. Number 7, realize that when you see somebody else make a mistake, you're better than them. This is huge for several reasons. When people see other players make mistakes, it makes them overconfident, both against that individual player and in general. The fact of the matter is, if you go through a session you played, like if you and I were sitting next to each other and we were going through every hand that you played, there would be so many hands where before I comment on it, you would say, oh, I messed that one up because of this, or oh, that was just a brain fart. I don't know what happened. Or I made a mistake there, but I know exactly what to do now. I normally know what to do there. So like, I get it. And those things are often true. Like we make mistakes. Like sometimes we just fail to think about what we should have thought about. Sometimes we didn't have enough time to figure it out in the moment and we acted. And afterwards we're like, oh, that was a mistake. I know better than that. So we give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. We accept those excuses in ourselves. But when we see somebody else make a bad play, we don't think, oh, they probably know what to do, but this time they messed up because they didn't have enough time to decide. Or, oh, they probably had a brain fart there and just, made a mistake, whatever. They're a better player than that. We see a mistake and we think, oh, they think that's a good play. We're better than them. And if you do this, in addition to not giving players enough credit, you're just going to put yourself in games that are potentially too tough for you. Like you're going to see an edge in games that you have no edge in potentially, because you are going to see great players make mistakes all the time. We all do it. 8th way to ensure an unsuccessful poker career is to move up when you lose to chase those losses. We all know that we shouldn't do this, yet a lot of people still do it. It's very comforting emotionally to book more wins than losses. And so this shows itself in number 6, where people are often quitting when they're winning and chasing losses when they're losing. And here in number 8, where once they lose, they move up because it gives you a better chance of having a winning day. It's essentially, there's a concept in gambling or kind of a strategy in gambling called the martingale strategy. The way it works is, let's say you're playing roulette, you're putting your money on black. You start by betting $5. And then if you win, you walk away, you won $5. If you lose, you bet $10. And then if you win that one, you walk away, you won $5. But if you lose that one, then you bet 20. Now, if you win that one, you walk away and you won $5. But if you lose, then you bet 40, and so on and so forth until you reach the maximum amount of money you're willing to bet. A lot of people think that because you're almost always going to walk away a winner, that's a winning strategy. But the fact of the matter is, each individual bet on roulette is a losing bet, and compounding them with a betting strategy doesn't actually turn them into winning bets. What's actually going to happen is, depending on your bankroll, if you're allowing for the martingale strategy, maybe 98% of the time you're going to walk away a winner, but that 2% of the time you're going to lose all the money you have. And every time you win, you only win $5. Coincidentally, I've seen a friend almost lose a ton of money doing that. He finally got it on like the $80,000 bet. So that's what people do. They apply it to poker as well, trying to chase losses so that they can have a winning day. Poker's not about how many winning days you have, it's how much you want at the end of the year. So definitely don't do this. And not to mention the fact that when you're losing, you're playing worse. Now you move up to play bigger stakes. First of all, maybe you shouldn't be playing those stakes, even your best state. But second of all, now you're not in your best state and you're moving up to higher stakes, risking more money. It's the exact wrong time to do it. Number 9, trust every charming person you meet. This was something I learned over the years coming from the online background. So like all my early years in poker were online and transitioning into live poker, and something that a lot of my friends that have done the same thing have come up against. Essentially, in poker, like in all walks of life, there are untrustworthy people. And because poker is a game of money, there are people who are looking to take advantage of other people. Usually those who are successful at that, they're successful because they're charming. They seem really nice. They seem great. They're really easy to talk to, get along with, and they seem trustworthy. I think a lot of people like to believe that they have a good kind of internal compass for, when a person's a good person. But the fact of the matter is, people who are kind of like career scammers, that they succeed because they're really good at fooling people. And really, if you're looking at people who are going to a lot of career scammers are probably going to be, probably going to be a psychopath. And those people are almost always charming. So I'm not saying that you should trust charming people less than people who are not charming, although maybe slightly. But essentially just protect yourself in all scenarios in poker. It's very easy to be influenced by people who are great at influencing you, and loan people money or stake them or whatever the case may be. If they're not somebody you've known a long time and have good reason to trust, be very careful. And number 10, final way to ensure that you have an unsuccessful poker career. After playing and studying enough, reach the point where you've got it all figured out. I have seen people do this where, they've been winning for a while and they just stop trying to learn. They especially stop trying to learn from other people. As I talked about earlier, learning with other people is, I think, the kind of biggest hack to growth. But some people reach the point where they're really successful and they've learned so much with other people, and then by themselves, they think they're better than everybody else, and they no longer want to learn with people. You never have it all figured out. You could always improve from where you are right now. Even the best player in the world could improve a lot. If you love the game and you don't think you've got it all figured out, then that passion and curiosity is going to help you continue to get better and better over the years. All right, so now let's talk about the 2 that I have suffered from in my poker career. Before I do, you may know from one of my last videos that I've started this challenge with myself. Half of that challenge is a fitness bet. The other half is growing my following on social media, creating more content like this that hopefully you guys enjoy. So for the first time yet on my YouTube channel, I'm going to ask you to subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed it. If you didn't, please tell me it sucked. But without further ado, let's get into the 2 that I suffered from. So first is the only learn by yourself. Like I said, I had periods where I learned with other people, but for the first couple of years, I learned by myself. There was then a period where a lot of my poker friends got out of poker. And I was kind of left with no poker friends, and I didn't make new poker friends for several years. This happened around the time that I was launching Run It Once Poker and focusing more on the business. I kind of lost touch with people to collaborate with on poker. So there were kind of 2 periods in my career where there were essentially lulls in my growth because I was learning by myself. The other one was number 9, trust every charming person you meet. I'm not ashamed to admit that I have given out some bad loans, invested in some players that I shouldn't have, and then have gotten taken advantage of. So it's been a while. I think I've learned my lesson after the first couple times, but it's something that I've suffered from, and a lot of my friends have as well. So I hope you found these helpful. If any of these resonated with you and there's something you need to change, go ahead and change them, and I'll see you in the next video.
For more advice on how to avoid these pitfalls, check out my free ebook, Poker Mindset Strategy. The link is in the pinned comment below. Now back to the video.
Game theory optimal strategy. Now, with the advent of solvers, we know exactly how we're supposed to play every given spot. So the question is it true that the closer you get to optimal strategy, the more edge you're going to have against your opponent? If you take two players and one has much closer execution to optimal strategy than the other, is that player always going to win? The answer is no. So let's talk about why. So in this example, we're going to be looking at a spot where one player is bet river, the other player is deciding to call or fold with a bluff catcher. The first opponent is Joe. So Joe is the person betting the river. He's bluffing 20% of the time, betting pot on the river when he's supposed to bluff 33% of the time, 33.3 repeating, to be bluffing optimally. His first opponent is Miss Optimal. Miss Optimal plays perfectly. She folds correctly according to game theory optimal strategies in every single spot. So what that means in this spot is she's going to fold 50% of the time. Now, a quick explainer of the reason that math works out the way it does. In optimal strategy, you want to construct a strategy where your opponent cannot improve their expectation by deviating one way or the other. So the reason that Miss Optimal folds the river 50% of the time is because if Miss Optimal folds 55% of the time, then Joe's supposed to bluff every hand that can bluff, because Joe's risking one pot size bet to win one pot size bet. So if Miss Optimal's folding over half the time, he's going to make money with his bluffs. Now, if Miss Optimal only folds 45% of the time, now Joe should actually not bluff because he's not going to get enough folds. That's why optimal strategy works out the way it does. As far as the Joe's betting range, it's supposed to be 33% bluffs, because when Miss Optimal calls with a bluff catcher, she's risking one pot size bet to win the pot plus Joe's pot size bet. So she's getting 2-to-1. So a third of the time she's supposed to win two pot size bets, and 2/3 of the time she's supposed to lose one pot size bet. And that's how she breaks even. If he was bluffing too little or too much, then she would adjust accordingly. So in this example, he's bluffing too little. She's still calling optimally, which cannot be exploited. She cannot be exploited by calling optimally. Joe is not gaining an edge on her because she's calling exactly optimally here. Just for the sake of easier math, let's say that Joe bets $10 into a $10 pot 100 times against Miss Optimal. So what's going to happen? 50 times Miss Optimal is going to fold, and her net result is $0 over those 50. 50 times Miss Optimal is going to call. So now what's her net result when she calls? Well, of those 50 times, Joe is bluffing 20%, which is 10 times out of 50. So 10 times Miss Optimal is going to win $20. And then the other 40 times that Miss Optimal calls, Joe's not going to be bluffing. Miss Optimal is going to lose $10. So the net result there, the 10 winning calls, that's 10 times $20 win equals $200. On the 40 losses, that's 40 times $10 equals $400. And so Miss Optimal's net result is 200 minus 400 for negative $200 over this 100 hand sample opportunity. Now, Miss Optimal lost money here, but she's not getting exploited. The reason that her optimal strategy lost money, when Joe's value betting, he gets called half the time. And that's going to happen no matter how often he's bluffing. His value bets are going to stay his value bets. He's not going to change his value bets. And so then his bluffs, if he added the requisite amount of bluffs, it would just be more hands actually that were bets. Because Miss Optimal would fold half the time, Joe would break even on all those extra bluffs that he's supposed to add, but it doesn't change his overall expectation. So let's talk about another player, Mr. Fold. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you want to let me know with a comment or a like, or most of all with a subscription to the channel, I would really appreciate it. Mr. Fold, as you might expect, folds a lot. In fact, he folds every time that he faces a river bet. This is a horribly, horribly exploitable strategy. If you're playing against somebody who never calls a river bet, you should crush them because you should bluff every hand. But he's playing against Joe, who's only bluffing 20% of the time when he pots river. So let's do the math on this. It's going to be a little bit easier. Joe's going to bet the river 100 times, and Mr. Fold is going to fold 100 times for a net result of $0. Mr. Fold is going to break even. Now notice that Mr. Fold broke even while Miss Optimal lost $200. And that's because despite her playing perfectly and Mr. Fold playing terribly, his strategy was exploiting Joe, who is playing only slightly badly. A 20% bluff in a spot where you're supposed to bluff 33% is pretty close. And that's actually something you'll see, like a lot of players are somewhere around there. So this is a strategy that is certainly closer to optimal. Now it's not the same spot, but certainly closer to optimal than Mr. Fold, but not quite as optimal as Miss Optimal. And yet the one who's doing best here at exploiting the other player is actually Mr. Fold. Mr. Fold is making the most money, or in this case, losing the least amount of money. Now, obviously, if you put Mr. Fold up against a Mrs. Bluff, Mr. Fold will be in a lot of trouble because Mrs. Bluff is going to bluff every river and Mr. Fold is going to fold every river, and he's just going to lose a lot more pots. Now, in the exact example of facing 100 river bets, he's going to perform the same. But in actuality, what's going to happen in the game is he's just facing river bets all the time and he's always folding the pot. The thing about the difference between theory and practice is that in practice, nobody's capable of optimal play. I'll give a more complex example, but without math. But hopefully you'll follow. So you and I are playing against each other. My river strategy is to fold 80% of the time when I'm supposed to only fold 50%. And then my bluffing strategy is I'm going to underbluff like Joe. I'm going to bluff 20% of the time. So I'm overfolding, I'm underbluffing, but your strategy is that you're slightly overcalling. So instead of folding 50%, you're folding 45%. And then instead of bluffing 33%, you're bluffing 20%, just like me. So our bluffing strategies are identical. So no edge gained or lost there. From a game theoretical perspective, yours is much better than mine. You're folding 45%, which is super close to 50%. I'm folding 80%, which is not that close to 50%. But if my 80% fold is an exploit, it's an adjustment to your underbluff, and you are not adjusting to my underbluff, I'm winning this game. I'm winning against you on the river. And this comes up all the time. The thing about it is, if you're so focused on trying to execute an optimal strategy that you're not looking for ways to deviate, you're not looking for leaks in your opponent, what's going to happen is you're not going to exploit any of your opponent's leaks, but if they're any good, are going to find yours and exploit them. So maybe you are folding 45% of rivers instead of 50, and their adjustment is they're going to stop bluffing as much. Now now they're making money in that game. And then let's say you're under bluffing against me, but let's say even you're bluffing 28% instead of 33, rather than 20% instead of 33. My adjustment should still be to fold a lot if you're never going to counter adjust. Now what's supposed to happen is, you're bluffing 28%. I realize that. I fold 80%. You realize that. You start bluffing everything, and so on and so forth. But if you're just focused on trying to execute a near optimal strategy, and you're not going to notice my deviations or care about my deviations because you're just trying to execute what a solver told you to do, the fact that you're human and you can't execute it perfectly, there are going to be gaps between your strategy and the solver strategy. And as a human, studying you, playing against you, seeing showdowns, seeing bluffs that you've missed, seeing calls that you've made that you shouldn't have, I will start to form these reads on you, and I will start to adjust and deviate. And if you're not noticing my adjustments, if you're just still trying to get as close as you can to optimal, you're going to lose. So it's a very common misconception that the player closest to optimal is going to win. The player closest to optimal is the least exploitable, but that's only if we're talking about somebody playing a static strategy. If you're playing a static strategy that's closer to optimal, and I'm playing a dynamic strategy that is trying to, be very exploitable, make huge overfolds or huge overcalls based on what you're doing, yet you're not going to counter, then I'm going to win. And it's as simple as that. Congratulations, you made it through this extra long video. I hope you enjoyed the tips, and if you're still here, you probably have. If you like these, you're going to like a lot of my other videos, so click subscribe so that you don't miss them. Until next time, I'm Phil Galfond. Take care and good luck.